Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello.
So we're going to have Undad, Koji, and Mystler joining us today, guys. Welcome, dudes. They've come over from, well, not just Ravenhold, but all over various aspects of the Rogue community, TC, high-end play, etc. Just like the other shows, to hang out with us, chat everything Rogue. We'll make some awful dad jokes along the way for stealthing, I'm sure, and other things. It's bad. Like, there's just no way it can happen. But guys, welcome. Thanks a lot for coming. Let's just start here real quick. Undad, if you want to introduce yourself, just let everyone know what you do in the Rogue community, who you are, etc.
Hello, I'm Undad. I actually just started playing Rogue as my main class at the beginning of BFA, and I primarily play Mythic Plus. I rate it like a relatively high level, and I have lost many MDI series. I've competed in all of them, and I've lost most of them. So that's where I come from.
All right. And I was there for most of this. Koji, go ahead. Koji? Is he muted?
Hey, thanks for having me. I do a bunch of the theory crafting work for the Rogue Spec, and along with Mystler, and we do a bunch of the APL work and involved in pretty much a lot of the Ravenhold theory crafting back and forth. Do mythic rating with occasional excellence, so with Babs, who was on here a little earlier for the World Windwalker talk. So keep busy and doing beta testing now.
Awesome. And Mystler, man, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, it's similar for me. I'm also a rogue theory crafter with Ravenhold. Been working on simulation craft and related tools for since early Legion, basically. And I'm also working on sites like Hero Damage, and currently trying to have a great overview of everything that's going on with Rogue. So trying to track all the bugs, how things work, making sure that Simcraft is updated. And I'm writing the guides for Wowhead, so there's a lot of things to keep track on and a lot of interesting stuff going on.
And I'm sure there's no bugs with rogues at all, right? They've funneled all of those to Windwalker, I'm sure. So as I'm sure some of you guys are familiar, Koji especially, because I've seen some of the prior episodes, and we know the doc. I like to start these things with a bit of history as to the Rogue spec, so it can just paint the picture essentially of how the spec is, or I don't want to say the specs, more the class is at its current state in Shadowlands, and what really led us down this road. I think the tone of the show is definitely going to be a bit different than in the past. Not necessarily kind of one of those like meme troubled specs like you get a lot with like Mistweaver we had recently, Feral, etc. Rogue generally has been a pretty prominent class, pretty dominant class in some cases. Obviously, some specs have maybe not performed up to snuff sometimes, at least from a community perception. Subtlety stands out oftentimes as perhaps not the most favorite in the public eye. So nonetheless, let's start with a bit of history of what really changed from WoD to Legion, because Legion is really when a lot of the substantial redesigns happen. I know near and dear to me, Combat changed over to Outlaw, unluckily. And so a lot of those changed. So whoever wants to tackle, I suppose let's start with Combat going to Outlaw, since I just mentioned it. Whoever wants to jump on that one between you guys.
I'd say for Outlaw, there was a lot of course, change towards this pirate fantasy. It was just renaming things like Sinister Strike becoming Saber Slash, which is something that we've iterated back on. But also additional flavor stuff like Pistol Shot, adding a kind of ranged element to the spec together with Between the Eyes. There was a lot of making Outlaw the fast-paced spec that was Combat, but all with a pirate scheme. There was Roll the Bones, obviously, that was added, which was a big deal, and still causes frustration for people with all the RNG. I think that was mostly it, and as I said, we've reverted on some things. With BFA, which was where there was some backlash, at least from part of the community, about that this is a little bit too much pirate and not the iconic rogue stuff. So there were things like Sinister Strike being Sinister Strike again, and some renames to Roll the Bones buff to make it more of a general brigand outlaw who's fighting with a sword and not the pirate topic.
Okay. And why don't you take us down a bit of the assassination road, Koji?
Sure. Yeah. So like, there was kind of a bunch of moderate changes for Legion. A lot of it came from the artifact ability. There were some early changes where, agonizing poison was a thing for the early tiers, and then that got removed because it was really easy to abuse. And a lot of rogues had a bunch of fun with it, but that disappeared pretty quickly. It kind of fell out of favor as a spec during Tomb of Sargeras, where sub became dominant, and then came back up in Taurus when we found tons of hilariously broken things with Fan of Knives talents and snapshotting and stuff like that. Really didn't have that many notable changes going into BFA. It was still playing more or less the same spec without the borrowed power aspect. Kind of made it feel a little empty because removing the Kingslayer mechanic was unfortunate when the core mechanics are fairly low button-wise. And then, it started out really slow pace, as you kind of almost expect from the energy classes in early expansion, like secondary ratings and stuff. But Assassination was really slow in Uldir. I think it was something like, 42 APM or something like that. I mean, it was very plodding. But there was some cool stuff that we could do with bleeds and the Shrouded Suffocation trait that got added that was pretty fun early on. So it was an okay transition from Legion to BFA, but not very exciting.
Right. And so really not too many substantial changes for Assass and Outlaw, essentially, old combat, leading into Legion, right? Where a lot of kind of classes and specs got pretty substantial redesigns. I mean, even some, resource redesigns, etc. Just complete rehaul to how they work. Really, the biggest thing between these two is, I guess, just more of that pirate fantasy that Mystler mentioned, moving into Legion. But Subtlety received some bigger changes at some point down the road. In Legion, you guys made a note here in 725, more substantially in terms of sub changes. And I know I kind of powwowed with you guys before the show, talked about my memory of rogues when I used to main a rogue back when I was 28 years old 40 years ago, and then we had Hemo rogue back then, etc., and a lot of things have changed since then for sub. I'd throw this to you, Dad, but I don't know how familiar you are with the things that have changed leading into Legion from WoD for sub, so I don't know if you want to handle that or if one of the other two guys, because he said he just started playing rogue in BFA.
Yeah, we'll let them talk about the Legion design stuff,
Sure.
just because that wasn't like I played most of the classes, but not at a level where I'm gonna be able to discuss it in depth. But the BFA stuff, I can definitely talk about when we get there.
All right, so Koji or Mystler, whoever wants to tackle it, why don't you tell us about some of the bigger changes that sub underwent throughout the course of Legion into BFA?
Well, the switch, especially the switch to Legion, was a very interesting one for sub, because I'm pretty sure everyone who's played Hellfire Citadel does remember what sub was looking like at the end of Hellfire Citadel, with all this heavy burst every minute gameplay, and of course the combinations with the Soul Capacitor trinket and the Legendary Ring. And because of that, it felt like a lot of significant changes to the spec. The Shadow Dance mechanic was completely reworked. Instead of being a flat 1 minute cooldown, that is your main damage driving aspect, it was reworked to be charge based. So that is to something that is much more common and that happens much more often. There were some additional changes like bleeds were removed, no more hemorrhage, no more rupture. Instead, there was a maintenance bleed called Nightblade. Everything was going towards the shadow mechanic. There was Shadow Strike, there was Shadow Blaze. There's so many abilities with shadows, which was kind of a big deal. And I think throughout Legion, especially early on, that Shadow Dance change was very visible. And instead of being this high burst thing that we saw in Hellfire Citadel, we saw a very sustained kind of spec, and with very high uptimes on Shadow Dance. And that's why I also mentioned in our outline already that there was another number of changes in 725, where they kind of addressed these issues that sub changed so much, and to flesh out the direction. It was with that patch that it was tuned down a little bit from this very, very sustained gameplay to a less sustained one. And it was also at that point where we got the rework of some talents, most notably Dark Shadows versus Enveloping Shadows, to kind of the thing that we still see right now on Live as well as on Shadowlands, where they kind of wanted to go for a choice between, do I want to dance less often for more damage burst in thought at least, versus a lot of dances and more of this sustained gameplay.
Yeah, I'd also say that like that kind of mid-tier phase in Legion definitely emphasizes these kind of like micro cooldown cycles that became, now is kind of the mainstay of sub, where especially at the time we were using the Death from Above talent, which shout outs for all the people who played sub back then, knowing how much it got them killed all the time. But you were doing these micro cycles of using Death from Above and macroing all your cooldowns together and using Eviscerate mid-air to use like these overlaps between all the cooldowns at the same time. It was pretty cool. But it required these like really tight cooldown cycles. And if you messed up the DFA combo cycles, your DPS was pretty much trash. So it was kind of like, it got a reputation, I think, in that tier for being a very unforgiving spec to play, even though I think that's really softened over time. But it was pretty easy to, like, if you weren't really optimizing those combos, your DPS just wasn't going to be very good.
Okay. So I guess in your guys, actually, you know what? I'll ask this a bit later once we cover the BFA stuff in terms of skill capping on each spec, because I think we're gonna have some brawling on that one. So we've discussed kind of the major changes leading into Legion. Question for you guys then, and you guys touched on BFA a bit too. Do you feel that the major changes that happened at the beginning of Legion were positive? A lot of people, or some specs that we've had, have felt, like nobody asked for this. Why did this happen? I liked WAD better, whatever it might be. Do you guys think these were generally all around positive rogue spec changes?
I guess to start with sub, there's still a lot of people that would like to have Wallets of Journey gameplay back with this heavy bursting. I think that is a very subjective thing, especially for subtlety though, because the gameplay has shifted to a good degree. And personally, I'm also a big fan of what they did in Legion. And I think all this doubling down on fleshing out the specs in terms of their flavor and what their setting and philosophy is, that was a very good thing and whole thing. So you could, before basically Rogue was very similar between three specs. And for somebody who just picks up Rogue and sees these three specs, I think this fleshing out in terms of fantasy was helping a lot to see more assassination. Okay, this is a very bleed-centric spec, or guess more classical rogue. There's Outlaw, where you really have had this pirate fantasy, and a lot of fast attacks, more button-smashing gameplay. And then there was Sub, which was all about this shadow magic aspect to it, which was really new, and I personally found it very refreshing.
What do you think, Koji?
Yeah, I agree. I think it was overwhelmingly positive. I think there were a few pain points where, we're seeing them kind of loop back around it now with Shadowlands with the poison changes, where I think there were some people that were kind of upset that they removed poisons from combat, for example, because poisons were stereotypically a fairly large part of combat. So when they migrated combat to Outlaw with zero poisons, that felt a little weird. And I think there were some oddities like that. But overall, I think it was fine. I think probably the main contention was some of the Outlaw stuff and Roll the Bones, because that's a very divisive mechanic among the rogue community, I think.
Roll the Bones. Okay, so mostly positive stuff that I'm gathering from you here. So then kind of diving a bit more into BFA, we don't have to go too crazy on it. And Undad, obviously you're now more familiar with what's been going on in BFA. There does exist, I don't want to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but there definitely does exist a bit of that community perception and meme hostility from the public towards sub, I would say especially. You once in a while you hear some just in general out lull and lull assassination and things like that, just based on whether or not they're powerful for the tier or not, is really what it comes down to. But subtlety in general seems to get a lot of flack. Do you think that's something that's founded in BFA? Like, is subtlety really kind of in that bad spot, or are people just not really grasping the actual power of it?
I think that sub found itself in very clearly like the least powerful, the rogue specs, which is like a unique situation for, like, when you talk about other specs with hybrid classes, sometimes you can chalk it up to community perception, but with rogue it's like when you play a pure DPS, I don't know how you pull the third DPS spec up and be like, hey, this isn't that bad, because just you're kind of expected to just play one of the better specs more often than when you play a hybrid class. So I don't think sub has been as bad as I think people think, but it's certainly been the worst after the great tuning of 8.1 and Zol and everything that happened with that.
That's right.
And everything that happened before Zol too, because sub got nerfs at the beginning of Uldir as well, just to their single target through the Blade in the Shadows trait that was pretty strong. Probably got nerfed too hard, but was certainly strong. And I think there's also an issue too where I think a lot of players don't quite get sub. I noticed when I first, because I picked up all three specs right at the beginning of BFA and jumping into them, and sub on paper seems to be the most intimidating, I think. When you try to learn like what do I do on this spec to do damage, it seems like there's a lot of things you have to balance. There's a lot more you have to balance than in reality you end up having to, and I think that turns some people away from playing the spec, just because they go to the guide on Wowhead or Icy Veins and they look at what they have to do for assassination, or they look at what they have to do for outlaw, and it seems like way easier to jump into than sub, and because of that they don't end up playing the spec, and then they don't quite understand it, and then they just think it's bad. So I think there's a lot of moving parts involved with the perception.
I think sub also can come across as very intimidating because of these very frequent short cooldown windows, whereas a lot of specs follow the design of you have your kind of filler rotation and then you have your cooldown periods every now and then. Sub is basically about having some kind of cooldown window almost all the time, and that can be very intimidating. And there's some tooltips that don't help that much either. When you look at Shadowlands and you see 2 or even 3 charges thrown at you, and then you have Symbols of Death with the 30-second cooldown. It's all very quick-paced stuff, and when you see it for the first time, you're like, okay, but how do I use this? So it can be very intimidating and not as straightforward as other specs.
Koji, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the numbers dictate how people feel about a spec a lot of the time. Like, a spec can be the most fun rotation in the universe, but if it does 20k DPS less than another spec, it's not good. So I think that's unfortunately the position sub has found itself in. At the core, I think it's a fun spec to play. I played it quite a bit early, Nyalotha, and like kind of the mid-tier or the resets of Warcraft logs. I was playing it to parse for fun, and the rotation is enjoyable. I think the feedback loop is good. I think the payoff for playing well is good. It just doesn't have the numbers, and that'd be a relatively simple thing, I think, to fix on Blizzard's side, and would dramatically shift the perception. But I do completely agree with what the other two guys are saying, that it can be very intimidating at times. We have another rogue in our guild, shout out Josmo, who has tried to play sub in Mythic as a bit of a meme the last couple weeks, fighting the good fight, and I know his first reaction was, how the hell do I play this spec? What buttons do I push? And it is definitely a lot harder to, I think, absorb at first glance than Assassination, which is just like, okay, keep your bleeds up, press Mutilate and then Venom. Okay, got it. I'll try.
Yeah, and then there was little maintenance, I'd say, from Blizzard sides on the spec. The last class-specific or spec-specific change we got was in patch 8.1. And by that time, we had our best single target trait nerfed 3 times, pretty heavily. We had, of course, the reaction to Zul, which removed Shuriken combo as a passive for that almost only niche that sub had until then. So yeah, that was a lot of short-term nerfs, but then no more maintenance across the expansion. So that sub kind of just fell behind, especially now with corruptions.
So, so this on this topic, just 1 second, because what I want to ask, relevant to what you guys are saying, do you feel that subtlety then is the hardest or high skill cap spec of the 3 specs to play? And do you think that that barrier to entry that's intimidating for players leads to a smaller population of subtlety players, and therefore maybe you get less attention from Blizzard? Like, why is it taking so long to tune? You guys keep saying it's just a numbers thing for sub. Like, why does it take so long for that? So go ahead with your thought with that in mind.
I think that it is accurate that it's the most difficult, but I don't think it's like a huge difference. I don't think it's as wide a gap as probably a lot of players perceive. And I think I want to say that the hesitance from Blizzard to tune throughout this expansion is that they're worried if they tune some numbers that they get Zol again, right? Like, I think Zol was so impactful that they just kind of were like, well, until we figure it out, next expansion, just deal with whatever you have right now, because they didn't want to have a repeat of that. I think the 3 of us all agree that there were pretty simple things they probably could have done that wouldn't have led to a situation like that. Just simply numbers tuning on generators rather than finishers, so you don't end up in these degenerate funnel DPS situations. It's also worth noting that they nerfed another thing that had a lot to do with Zol too, in when they changed our first dance trait. The first dance trait used to be a big crit buff when we entered Shadow Dance in 8.0, which when you're entering Shadow Dance so many times on a fight like Zol ends up being a huge amount of damage. And they moved that to be more single target oriented and also to generate combo points. So just as like a little aside, there were a lot of factors that went into decimating the spec after that first tier.
But wasn't it like, is it really like a fear of Zol that they kind of were worried to rebuff the spec? Because that was such a niche situation. Like, on how many raid bosses do you actually get to sit there and just chain funnel max CP on like a 2 GCD cycle or whatever it was, Koji?
Not many. We were talking about it before, in the preamble, that it does seem like it was a bit of a fear of the unknown, but it's a fairly contrived case. Like the gear setup and the very specific talent setup that we were running for Zool was really not applicable to the vast majority of encounters, or even like a Mythic plus dungeon or whatever. It would just not have done any damage outside of that very specific funnel situation. It was just like this full mastery build and full mastery sockets and yada yada. It was just like built all around having, this 2-button rotation, and that's all you do. And that's just not very realistic outside of that one situation. I think we saw shades of it in Tomb of Sargeras with Mistress, and I think Mistress gave us a bit of a fear that this kind of problem was going to happen. And I know we talked about it in Tomb at the time and in the Rogue community, that it was just kind of like a ticking time bomb.
So do you think, Mystler, that as a result, or a technical question for everybody, obviously, all of these are, do you think that the result of kind of over nerfing really and kind of gutting the spec after the Zool dilemma, do you think that led to a bit of an identity crisis loss on sub's part? Like, what is their niche in their eyes, do you guys think, at the moment? Like, where do they really fall into gameplay? Why is it that you just keep looking at Outlaw and Assassin in most situations here?
Even with the removal of Fearing Combo, the niche of priority damage is technically not really gone. It just does not really have a lot of relevance in the current content. And as I said before, there were almost no changes after that nerf phase was done. And that kind of led to Sub falling behind. I think Sub was still fine in Battle for the Zara Law. And you could do well. It was just that not so many players played it anymore. But then it fell behind. Eternal Palace was already a little bit awkward, and boss design was also not perfect for Sub. And now Nylothar with Corruption, that's just completely, it feels like a forgotten spec that I don't know why there ultimately was no further changes. Maybe it was being a little bit of afraid of excellently doing something again, and something like Zool returning or so. I can only guess.
Okay, so for the most part, for BFA, the star of the show was Outlaw, right? With some pocket assass here and there. Correct me if I'm wrong. Subtlety was mostly forgotten. Would you guys agree with that?
Yes and no. I think Assassination was certainly relevant in all of raid content, and Outlaw was dominant in Mythic Plus. They kind of shared. They were both good enough in both content, or both forms of content, and Assassination happened to be better in most raiding scenarios, and Outlaw was better in most Mythic Plus scenarios. So it was a healthy balance for those two at the least.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Outlaw was very strong in Mythic Plus, as everybody knows. And pretty strong on a couple particular cleave fights in raid. So it was definitely shared between like Assassination and Outlaw. I think Sub. I'm trying to think of when, people putting Zool aside because that was an obvious breakpoint. Even early on, I think people are mentioning in chat that like the Blade in the Shadows Azurite trait, which was the strongest one for like single target for Sub at launch, was nerfed something like 3 hot fixes in a row. Like not exaggerating there. It was like literally 3 times in a row. And it was a little too dramatic. I think they were overreacting to some of the damage patterns that were present on the older bosses, where you could do a lot of damage amp at the end of the fight, like on Mother in the last room, or on Fetid with a damage amp with Lust, in the final phase in Heroic or Normal, whatever, and Sub was putting up these crazy numbers. A lot of that didn't actually translate very well to Mythic, and I think they basically massively overreacted to those nerfs, and it kind of quickly shifted Sub away from being the meta pick even in raids until Zool, where it was abused for that specific purpose. But people had already dropped Sub in most of the Zool progression, or most of the older progression fights before Zool.
Okay. So, some of it we've already touched on, and oftentimes we're just going to kind of, if we get a thought, we're going to go with it. So sometimes where we go with the thoughts for the doc is going to scatter a bit. But you guys have touched a bit on the whole why didn't this work thing. It seems like for the most part, outside of maybe some more minor grievances, Assass and Outlaw were functional, at least to put it generally speaking. Obviously, everybody has their own gripes with their own specs, and they want this and they want that, smaller things. But it wasn't a completely broken spec or 2 completely broken specs full of bugs, etc. So moving forward, there's always room for improvement, but they were popular, in a good place, good utility, brought to groups. So is it just numbers then, in your guys' opinion, that Sub kind of fell off the wagon in constant nerfs? Or is there something from like a core design perspective that is lacking for the spec right now that just puts it so far behind the others?
I think it's mostly numbers, and I think it's also the case of a lot of specs outside of Rogue that did poorly over the course of BFA were specs that just lost the Azurite lottery, right? Mm-hmm. Like Assassination and Outlaw both got traits that they really like stacking. They could fill out a build with 6 traits that all felt very powerful to wear. And Sub didn't really have that. Like we ended up in a place where we're wearing 3 Knights Vengeance traits for raid. Doesn't really translate well to Mythic Plus. We lost our Mythic Plus trait in First Dance for a First Dance version that we only want to run 1 of. So it became difficult to build out a set of 6 traits that you really cared about having, I think, on Sub, compared to the other Rogue specs and compared to other powerful specs in general. So I think kind of the theme of this is there's a lot of different compounding things that all kind of happened around the 8.1 time that we just never recovered from numerically.
Okay, cool.
I also think that it is, at least to a degree, Assassination is a relatively resistant spec to tuning and the balancing between the specs. But sometimes it feels a little bit like they are tuning the specs to be all equal, but that is obviously not very possible. And if you, for example, look at single target Assassination and Sub, have often been, even after all the nerfs, similar on paper, but Assassination is much more resistant to downtimes because of all the bleeds, and it has a lot slower pacing. So it's easier to do your at least key damage on the spec, whereas a Sub Rogue, as soon as you have any downtime, you can't hit the boss or so. you lose out on a lot of positive feedback loops. You do not get your cooldown reduction as a sub rogue. It's the same for outlaw rogues, of course. Outlaw are very fast paced with a lot of energy, and as soon as they can hit something, that hurts pretty hard, and you also miss out on all the cooldown reduction. So that kind of makes assassination the most resistant one, and that's why assassination, even if it's not the best spec, maybe it's always a solid pick, basically.
Okay. Koji, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that was the case going into Antorus when, like, Assassin made a bit of a comeback after Tomb. Part of it was because we found some broken stuff, and some rogues probably remember the first couple of weeks when we were spamming Fan of Knives even on single target. But even before we found that out, the notion really was that if the numbers are roughly the same, we will play Assassination this tier, because there's just so much downtime. There's so much running away from the boss, do some mechanic, go fight some ads, and sub just falls apart if you're losing that contact time on the boss. Whereas, like, Assassination obviously loses some of it, but if you're really smart with your energy management and your shadow steps and how you're putting bleeds up and refreshing and dumping your energy, you can actually really minimize the negative impact from moving and getting off the boss. So that's definitely like a big plus for the raiding scene.
So then you guys haven't mentioned Outlaw too much right now. Is Outlaw just kind of trapped in that powerful cleave niche then, that doesn't too often apply to raiding? Obviously, in some circumstances it does, but not often.
I think it is. We were talking about before the show. I had looked back to see when the last time combat/outlaw was played as a top selection in a raid tier, and you have to go back to like Blackrock Foundry or something like that. So it's
really?
like 11 tiers that it's been kind of like in this, hey, that's kind of the quirky dungeon spec that you play in your spare time or to cleave. And it does really feel trapped in that. And I'm not totally sure why, because it would be relatively straightforward to make their single target reasonable. And I think other specs with decent AoE cleave, like Beast Mastery Hunters, are tuned in a way that that's plausible. So I don't know why they're resistant to do it with Outlaw, but it does seem to be a thing. Outlaw's single target is not good.
Well, do you think that, I mean, it's, when you're talking about, we had Enhanced Ellie on here at one point, right? So when you're talking about 2 DPS specs that differ in roles, it's easier to draw differences between them. Why bring each one? Why not bring each one, etc.? But when you're on an entire class trapped within the same role spec-wise, do you think it starts to get a bit difficult to really differentiate them? Do they all need separate niches? Like, does Assass need to be the raid one and sub maybe, I don't know, like the PvP or whatever, and Outlaw and the more M plus cleavy one? Like, can you really strive for an area? Like, do you think we'll ever get to a point in raid where it's like, well, here's a single target boss and all 3 specs are good choices right now?
I think the community is actually a little bit split on how they feel about this topic. Like, I stand on the side of the fence where, like, I don't mind that I don't play Outlaw and Raid, but I do in Dungeons, and I play Assassination or Sub in whatever situation that it's better. But you have players that do, like, they hold a single spec dear to them, and they want to be able to play that and feel effective, which is, like, understandable. And where you go from that as, like, a developer at Blizzard, I don't know what the intention should be. I just kind of know how I feel about it. I think even we differ. Like, the 3 of us differ on where we stand on that, as far as if a spec should be viable now and again in Raid, even though it's an amazing dungeon spec, or if you can keep those things separate and still have the class function well as a whole.
Koji, big smile on your face. What's going through your head?
Oh, Mystler's the one trick of the group for sure. He is devoted to his sub. He's devoted, and I respect that. I have no problem swapping. I play whatever. I've played all 3 specs during Mythic Prog in BFA, and I have no problem. But I get it, and I feel like, especially with their push towards class fantasy, and also a lot of very restrictive like gameplay systems, like Azerite did not make it easy to swap specs, and certainly there's been a lot of talk in Shadowlands about contentious mechanics that also cause that dilemma. And I don't actually think it's unreasonable for people to be like, okay, well, I've picked to get my gear for Outlaw, but then I go and do raids and I'm not good. That kind of feels bad, right? It's not great, I think, for those players when, you know, you have to look and reforging your Azurite and spending hundreds of gold between raid nights, like trying to do that or farm up extra pieces or whatever. It's not a great gameplay loop.
What do you think, Mystler? Father of sub-rogues?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly be happy if sub was more viable in all kinds of situations. But it's the same between obviously Assassination and Outlaw, which has this kind of thing that one is the AOE spec and the other is a single target spec, with exceptions, of course. I doubt you can eliminate something like that altogether from a pure DPS class. That is impossible. But it's a little bit, I think, on the extreme. And somebody who one tricks and wants to just play the spec because they like the spec should at least still feel good and useful in every situation. And if you get a situation like Zool for sub, for example, then you should have that moment of, okay, I have something here that I can do that is very cool and makes me a little bit better, but it shouldn't be like we saw with sub, that it was absolutely way too good and had this overpowering perception, whereas in other content you started to fall back very quickly. The gap was too big, basically.
Okay, so then if we can't, I mean, you know, single target DPS, let's say in a raid, is a very broad topic, right? And for instance, Koji mentioned that Assass can, you know, they excel in situations where you constantly have to run away from the boss, manage your dots properly, when to dump energy, etc. So what do you think, Mystler, is a direction that they can kind of buff or give a little love to sub to make it more competitive but still have a different niche in a raid situation? Would it be like burst damage maybe, you know, during a boss like Sludge Fist, for instance, the 8th boss in the new raid, you know, he takes 200% increased damage or whatever, 100% increased damage for 8 seconds. Is that something that sub can maybe excel at that you wouldn't want to bring Assass for during?
I'm not sure to what degree sub would really need many mechanical changes to achieve that. Right now, it's mostly a numerical problem. Buff the spec aura by a little bit, and that would already fix a lot. Sub still has advantages that I think are really cool and feel rewarding to play around. Mostly because of these short cooldown periods. Like when somebody in my guild, for example, in a raid asks, do you have cooldowns ready? I like to say I always have cooldowns ready, because that feels very rewarding about sub. Whenever there's an important ad coming up, another phase, there's a burst mechanic, whatever, you feel like you always have some Shadow Dance symbols window ready where you can just on-demand fire on something and you don't have to go through setups like Assassination. You need your big cooldowns that are kept to every 2 minutes, that you only have every 2 minutes, and that is a very rewarding thing and kind of a focusing gameplay that I personally enjoy.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just numbers, right? Like, because we're seeing already in the Shadowlands like raid testing that sub is getting a lot of preference from, you know, the raiding rogues, identifying that this looks like, you know, with the current numbers we have, and obviously there's a very broken legendary involved, but even putting that aside, sub looks positioned to be pretty strong in Shadowlands with the current numbers and mechanics. Whether or not that will hold with the final numbers tuning is, you know, completely out of our hands. But I think if the numbers are there, you know, I'm happy to play sub. I know a lot of other raiders are happy to play sub. You know, going
in terms of single target damage, it's, I think, mostly a numerical thing. As we said earlier, sub gets a little bit more punished from downtimes, but I think that is something that can be addressed via tuning. Just make sub on paper a little bit better than Assassination, so that it should kind of average out. So Assassination is a solid spec when you have downtimes, and sub, if you are really good at playing and minimizing those downtimes, or you have a patchwork fight, I don't know, then you are a little bit better on paper, but in the end it should somewhat average out and single target damage at least. I think in terms of these niche situations and where picks matter, that is a much more common problem with Assassination versus Outlaw currently in terms of AoE versus single target.
Okay.
I think your mention of Sludge Fist as well is that is a good example of a fight that probably will favor sub, even if numbers are even among the 3 specs, given it's a minute. Every minute you want damage, and sub has damage every 30 seconds, so it's going to line up for every exposed phase. You have damage for 10 seconds. The exposed phases are 12 seconds. So that's a good example of where even if the numbers are similar, you may favor sub over assassination, even though previously we talked about how assassination does benefit from a lot of raid fights. So it's definitely case specific.
So is there any hope for Assass and Sub to thrive in an M+ environment then? In a dungeon environment, seeing as Outlaw is kind of the niche Blade Flurry, 80% damage done that we talked about earlier. They seem to be the Cleave Kings right now.
I think definitely. I've played all 3 specs pretty extensively already on beta, and while there's some beneficial bugs for both Sub and Outlaw right now, or what we think are bugs, I get the vibe that when those are fixed and cleaned up, that all 3 specs are going to be relatively close, with Assassination maybe lagging a little bit behind, just because of just lack of energy and kind of an awkward way of opening on packs before you get your resources set up, which is, I'm sure we'll talk about Slice and Dice being introduced later, and I think that's part of what is holding Assassination back a little bit, and will hopefully get addressed. But right now, all 3 specs look very close, at least, going into Shadowlands from a dungeon perspective.
Yeah, you guys agree, Koji, Mystler?
Yeah, I think so. I think the target caps kind of even the playing field to some degree, because the effectiveness of, say, multi-dotting, for example, is relative to the effectiveness of pure AoE, and this brings those 2 things a lot closer together. I also think that it's, they're pushing kind of a poison damage theme a little harder with the conduits and some of the legendaries, and I think Assassination should be able to get a build that can do a lot of effective like AoE poison damage through Fan of Knives and stuff that should be pretty solid. So I think they can all do pretty well in Mythic Plus. I do think right now Outlaw looks a lot stronger than it should be because of the bug that Undad mentioned. That when we use Blade Flurry, the instant damage itself is Blade Flurrying, so it gets this quadratic scaling thing going on, which is obviously, I think, pretty unintended. It happened with the Drestagath trinket briefly until they hotfixed it a couple months back. Very similar bug, but it does, like, I think what Undad you were saying is about 8% extra damage or something like that across the dungeon or something like that.
It's like roughly 8 to 10% overall damage in a dungeon is being done by that bug. So when that gets pulled back into line, I think the specs will be close.
Well, that makes sense why popping Blade Flurry just absolutely chunks an enemy down right away. Okay.
Initially, I thought that it was uncapped incorrectly. Initially, I thought, because all these damage numbers popped out, and I was like, what just happened? I'm like, why am I doing so much damage with one press? And then looking at it, found that it was the flurrying effect that was causing all the damage numbers to pop.
Is this the point where we should just, as a fun fact, mention that they typoed the ability name and it's actually called Blade Furry, and they never fixed that in 4 months?
Blade Furry? Oh, we're talking. I'm on that Volpera right now. Okay, so kind of given everything we've talked about leading up to the doorsteps of Shadowlands right now, it seems to me at least safe to say that I understand at least where the community niche criticism perspective comes from. Like, it makes sense. Assass often for raid, Outlaw often for dungeon, Sub just seems to have not found its home. What I think most people, at least most non-rogue people that just have an outside view in, think about Sub, don't know about Sub, is what you mentioned, is just a numbers thing, right? So it seems that, in your guys' opinion, it's kind of like a half community, half Blizzard reasoning perspective because of Blizzard's poor tuning or lack of attention to tuning or slow attention to Sub. It's been put in this kind of meme place, for lack of a better word, and as a result, the community's kind of harped on it a bit, Koji?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think the numbers get fixed and that will come back around and people will like it again.
Do you think it goes both ways too? Like Outlaw benefited from a lack of tuning for a long time, right? Like Sub was at the mercy of slow tuning, and Outlaw existed in its busted state after 8.1 gave him wits for 9 months before any single tuning anything had happened. So it goes both ways for sure.
So then, from Mystler, from a community perspective, have you ever had issues as sub, because you love sub, getting into, I don't know, your weekly M plus key, like, oh, you're just, if you don't play outlaw, so you're not coming over, even if we want a rogue? Or has the rogue kit itself and general rogue reputation been enough to still allow you to get to groups as sub, you know, Shroud of Concealment, etc.?
Well, I have to confess, to be honest, that for the Mythic Plus keys, I actually also played Outlaw. I did play through all of the raids as sub though, so that includes Mythic N'Zoth on sub. I think currently after the last nerf on Walk of Flocks, there are 61 sub rogues that killed N'Zoth. I think there is some kind of perception feedback loop here going on. There's the numbers weren't there, so many people played the other specs, and that kind of led sub to fall even more behind. And then that was I mean, obviously community perception likes to over exaggerate a little bit, and if they see, oh, this is the worst spec, then we don't take that. I've personally not really run into problems. I'm also not packing that much, and I have a lovely guild of nice people that take me anyway, even if I play sub. So big shout out to those.
Like you see that for Outlaw too on the raid front, where sometimes the diehard and really good Outlaw rogues can have a hard time getting into groups. And I know a bunch of Outlaw rogues that can totally pump in raids. I can look at logs from like Locktark or Forever Guy or whatever, and they put up big numbers. But if you app to a guild and be like, I want to be an Outlaw rogue in your guild, you're gonna get rejected 9 out of 10 times. They're only going to be recruiting assassination. So that it is a problem.
Undad, from your perspective on especially the Mythic Plus front, did you find yourself ever that, with your team wanting to compete, etc., you're like, man, I would really love to play Assass or sub here, and they're like, nah, man, Outlaw or get out kind of thing?
We actually talked about this during the pre-roll, about how every tournament I played in this expansion, the first 2 days on Tournament Realm was just me trying to figure out how to make sub work. That was just I have to get this out of the way. It's either going to work or it's not, but it needs to be done early rather than later, because I'm going to get a lot of pushback from the team. They're not going to want me to play it. And then I would take it specifically to Toldagor first pull. Pulling everything with Sand Queen was the test for, am I allowed to play sub? And usually the priority damage was sick, like it's supposed to be, but none of the trash would die. So then I would just swap to Outlaw. And that was kind of how it went. But the effort was made. I don't know that it was necessarily pressure from the team. In that kind of environment, I'm trying to play what is best, right? I'm not upset or frustrated or really trying to push hard for a specific spec, but definitely put in effort to try to make it work.
Okay.
Just lost out.
I guess it's also noteworthy that the Keep Your Wits trade kind of gave Outlaw that priority target damage niche as well, at least to a good degree. So if you go Outlaw, especially in M+, you kind of have the best of both worlds. You still have a fair amount of priority damage, but you also have all the AoE.
Well, one thing communal to the Rogue kit across all specs is a lot of their utility, right? In the previous shows that we've had, because we started with the specs that we did, one of the main focuses and issues for a lot of these specs was we just lack utility. And the common theme amongst all of them outside of the utility lack is, why bring us when you can just bring a Havoc Demon Hunter? And we hate Havoc Demon Hunter players. Rogue is, Rogue is very popular in M+, right? Shroud of Concealment's huge. It's been a very contentious point for a lot of people. Rogue deserving a spot for it. Just give it to another class. Give us a pot for it. I'm sick of having to have a Rogue in the group for it, etc. Obviously, you have, Blind, Sap, one of the only 2 true CCs, Sap, Gouge. Just so much control on elements inside of Mythic Plus. But the story changes a bit when we go to raiding, right? A lot of that type of utility is just not as applicable, I would say. Like Shadow Concealment, you just use it to creep up on the boss, so you get an extra 5-10 yards on the boss. Oftentimes, we don't need most of the other utility that you have in M+. So do you think that from a raid perspective, Koji, it's a bit more... it's not as clear-cut that we have to have a rogue in our group for sure? What do you think makes rogues deserving of the spot, and do you think it's overshadowed by something like a Havoc Demon Hunter?
I think our raid spots are very contingent on Cloak of Shadows right now, and if it can be abused on a boss fight. I think otherwise groups tend to bring their rogues because they've got rogues, and a lot of those rogues are good players, so they get brought. But if you are looking at it from a pure like comp optimization standpoint, there are a very large number of fights that do not need rogues. And you would probably be better served bringing another spec if all other things were equal with the players and gear and yada yada. I think Cloak is the saving grace on a fight like N'Zoth, where you need X number of immunities and you're trying to fill your 10 immunity slots. It does help that throw some rogues in there to do that. But we are getting in a place where even that is falling away somewhat. We're seeing an increasing number of mechanics on Shadowlands raid testing, and even through BFA was starting to happen that are Cloak immune to everything. Just Cloak doesn't do anything meaningful on the encounter. And I pretty much the first thing I do on any raid testing encounter, or even learning in Prague, is what does Feint work on? What does Cloak work on? What does Evasion work on? And try to figure out if there's anything I can actually abuse. And the vast majority of fights right now are nothing, and nothing. So it's just like, it is starting to get a little worrying from a raid perspective that, without a raid buff, without a lot of compelling utility, there isn't actually that much reason to bring a rogue, other than who the person is, or maybe if the numbers are overtuned.
And do you guys feel, Undad and Mystler, that this is a discussion that we have across with the other guys too? The concept, or not the concept, but the reality rather, of utility, raid buffs, and debuffs. Do you think that Rogue maybe needs something like that? As you mentioned, Koji, there's a lot of bleed fights, for instance, coming up in Castle Nathria. Not exactly something Cloak of Shadows is going to pretty much do anything against. So do you think that Rogue maybe needs a bit of love in the utility department in order to perhaps have a better position to be brought to raids outside of its, just Cloak of Shadows? And just to add a bit onto that before you start answering, generally, would you like to see the game move in a direction of maybe a bit more homogenization of these utility traits, like maybe have more than one class bring 5% physical debuff, etc.? Would you prefer to just see them wiped completely, or do you think Rogue should bring something unique, like a different aura that we don't see on any other class?
I think Rogue has this perception, especially by non-rogues, of being a class with a lot of utility and a lot of survivability, which I think is very over-exaggerated and not really true. We have a lot of cool utility stuff numerically, a lot of different abilities, but there's hardly situations where multiple of them matter, especially in raids with the defensives. As Koji said, we have to kind of figure out what works on a case-by-case basis. So I would say it's not really that rogues are brought for utility or for being a utility class. It's more like rogues have this one specific thing. For example, the cloak for the harvesters on the Zors. And that's what they are brought in for, because of that immunity for that one mechanic. And personally, I would say I'd rather have consistent utility than a lot of utility. And it's a weird situation with having to figure out what works. I would rather have only cloak maybe that works on everything instead of so many cooldowns and this inconsistency.
Undad, what do you think?
To talk about the raid buff thing, I'm on the side where I would prefer they just didn't exist. But you can go either way. I think homogenizing them so that they're brought by more classes, or removing them entirely, kind of accomplish the same thing. That you're bringing classes for maybe what their damage profile is, or other utilities that they have, rather than just, I need one of these in my group for every raid boss, or I do 5% less damage. I don't particularly like that design. But regarding survivability and utility in raids, I think the biggest issue that the developers have is figuring out what to do with Rogue when their utility is so good in Mythic Plus to also make it useful in Raid. Like it doesn't transfer to Raid the way it does in Mythic Plus. Things like Gouge, things like Cheap Shot for sub being free when you're in Shadow Dance if you take a talent. Things like Blind and Sap that you mentioned being able to vanish off abilities in Mythic Plus. Most abilities are cloakable in Mythic Plus. Shadowlands, there's a few I've found that aren't, that I would think are, but certainly more than are in the raid. There's even many things you can evasion in Mythic Plus where you get very little use out of that in raid. So I think just the fact that Mythic Plus exists now has put the developers in like a hole as far as figuring out what to do with rogue survivability, because it's so vastly different in both game types.
So, I mean, I totally agree with that. So, I mean, at some point, if they're going to rebalance it, that means you're going to have to probably get some things nerfed or taken away, because you just have too much in M+,
Sure.
and then too little in Raid. And into that point, Shroud of Concealment, right, is such a ridiculously powerful thing in M+, and vastly useless in raiding. What kind of position do you think that puts you in, Koji, for rogues being brought, like, just because of that huge utility? As unbiasedly as you can say, do you think it's fair that one class gets that kind of power and nobody else does? Would you like to see that changed in any way? Like, how do you handle the kind of problem that Undad just talked about with rogues' prowess and M+ in terms of utility? Not so much in raid, though.
Yeah, I'll probably be unpopular among the rogue community by saying this, but no, I don't think it's fair that it's just one class. I think it's bad for the game. I think raid buffs in general are bad to just only put on one spec or one class, because I think it's unfair to players in a game where we have so many specs and so much diversity of what people play, and to just like narrow that down to like 1 out of 30 is not fair. So I would like to see it be a little more equitable, and I think it would open up more avenues for people, and even Blizzard being open to the idea of changing some rogue utility for the positive, if we weren't always like, lol, why are you complaining, you have blah, because that becomes, I think, a big problem in the feedback loop of like, rogues clearly don't need help getting into Mythic Plus groups, right? And there are plenty of specs that do need help, and they get the focus. And that was actually a big reason. I know, I heard about the rationale in BFA alpha and beta about the physical debuff used to be on rogues, the monk one. And for quite a few alpha builds, rogues had that debuff. And it was shifted from rogues to monks, mostly as a reaction to them trying to increase monk representation in Mythic Plus. And their thought process was, well, rogues don't really need this. They get brought to dungeons anyway. So it got shifted out. But obviously that had a huge impact on raid slots, right? And you have warriors and havoc demon hunters, quote unquote, filling up melee slots. And this expansion had a lot of melee unfriendly fights, and that it gets pretty easy to get pushed off that way.
Go ahead. Oh, is that, sorry, did I cut you out? I didn't mean to cut you off by
No, that's fine.
Breathing in deeply. So do you feel like then, since we're kind of teetering on that path, do you feel like we've started to move too far in this game? And Rogue's a very good example of this, where we've moved too far in a direction where Blizzard is designing it so that everybody is starting to feel trying to feel special in their own way and bring something unique, so that everybody has something awesome to put on their resume for bringing to raid or dungeons. But really it starts to maybe backfire a bit, because you just can't, it's not apples to apples, right? You can't compare Shroud of Concealment to a 5% physical debuff in M+, and then you have to take into account the fact that there's 36 specs for either 5 or 20 positions, etc. So do you and obviously, to exacerbate the issue, moving into Shadowlands with some of the systems that further separate you with powers of covenants and dungeons, etc. Do you think like we're starting to move maybe too far in a direction, and Rogue is in a good example of this, just having so much power in M+ and not so much in Raid, that we need to maybe pull back a bit from this class unique, I bring this to the group identity? Undad?
I don't know how hot this take is going to be, but I pretty much fully agree with what you're saying, that as long as the classes play differently, like I feel different playing them, which in large parts I feel like you do. Like you could make the comparison, a lot of classes are builder spender, but usually the way they build and the way they spend is different enough that there's a definite distinction between what classes you're playing. These super impactful utilities I think can be shifted and given to more classes. Things like Shroud. Granted, like we've seen that Rogue's utility is enough to bring them to groups, even when Shroud isn't necessary. In the current season with Awakened, like a Rogue does a lot outside of Shroud. So sharing Shroud is like the first step, I think, to bringing other classes into that realm, where maybe Rogue needs something else given to other classes as well to bring them more into the forefront of Mythic Plus. But I fully agree that all these things should just be given. Like, why do two classes have true CCs? What is the thought process behind that, and how do you balance the value that gives in skipping packs to Rogue and Demon Hunter? Like, how do you, from a developer's perspective, I don't know how you plan to make a dungeon that doesn't require specs like that, to be fun for everyone. You know what I mean?
Mystler, what do you think?
I like this slogan that was going on several expansions ago with "Bring the player and not the class," which is something that Blizzard has kind of abandoned. I think there's even a quote by Agnes Costas himself where they kind of abandoned that one. And I think that's a little bit sad. I was personally very happy to see when they removed buffs going into Legion. I mean, I can just understand that there is some kind of... it's not easy to just make every class in Spec viable, that you can just bring whatever you want. And it's easier said than done. If I say I would love that to be the case. But yeah, that's kind of what I would like to see. You could just bring the player, really. And I was very surprised when they decided to bring the buffs back, obviously to address some class play issues, but there are probably screws that you can turn that are better than just bringing back class buffs. And I don't think buffs are any kind of engaging gameplay. It's a button you press every hour. So if it doesn't really add anything to gameplay, why do you add it in the first place?
Koji, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what was the counter quote? Sometimes it's okay to bring the class and not the player, I think is what he said in an interview a while ago. And I agree with that in principle, but I think I agree with what you're implying, that we've gone a little too far the other direction, where it's mostly about bring the class right now. Class matters more than almost anything else when you're building comps. And I think I would like to see it come back somewhere in the middle, somewhere, maybe share stuff out between one or two specs. So there's some kind of redundancy there on mechanics, and you can kind of open up your comp options, open up your Mythic Plus Q options a little bit, rather than being like, we need blah. I think that's just unhealthy when you have so many specs in the game.
To pick up from Shed, this doesn't really matter much in Shadowlands anyway, because it will be Bring the Covenant, right?
Yeah.
No, man, stop, man, no.
Oof. I can hear police sirens in the distance right now. Yeah, I mean, certainly it's about balance, right? I'm not talking about the Druid. It's about, like, you don't want to go too far in the realm of homogenization, right? And then there's just no class identity at all, and it doesn't matter what you bring at all. But swing too far the other way, and we end up in this situation. But to the same note, do you guys think that the issue that we're having with maybe the pendulum swinging too far in the direction of everybody has their own unique buffs and things that they bring, do you think that that's a concern for a more hardcore crowd in the game? And that these, perhaps as people see them, more minor buffs, like in a more casual nature, whatever it may be, 5% AP in Shadowlands, etc., from Battle Shout, do you think that's not as big of a deal to maybe the more of the core or casual player base, and that it's something that you concern yourselves with at the higher end? Or do you see that as kind of just a game-breaking issue amongst everybody?
I think it may be not so much hardcore versus casual, but players that have a core group that they play with versus players that pug, like that distinction. I think may be the better one to make, because when you have players that you play with consistently, and that when you get to the high level you tend to find that, so there is some correlation there. But even at a more casual level, if you have friends to play with or a group of people you play with, a lot of the time the shortcomings of your class or spec or whatever aren't as big a deal, because you're just going to play with those people anyway. But when you go into the pug world and it's like, I want to play an off-meta spec or an off-meta class or something that doesn't have rogue utility in Mythic Plus and pug my keys, it's like, good luck. Good, you know what I mean? Compared to, I can queue up on an undergeared rogue and just get into most groups, compared to something that may have 10 to 20 item levels on me. Like, like a feral druid or an enhanced shaman or something like that, which is obviously like a benefit of playing rogue and something that I swapped to rogue for specifically. But I don't think players should feel like they have to do that, right? I didn't mind doing it, but I know most people don't share that same thought process.
I think it's similar to what we had earlier with the tuning aspect of what spec to pick in, for example, single target versus AOE, etc. It's a perception issue, and that is most noticeable again in pucks, where it can obviously be over exaggerated as well.
I think even casual groups tend to follow meta decisions, and it gets a little delayed and trickles down. But quite a few people do stuff like watch the MDI streams or watch the arena streams and watch the world first race, and they do absorb those facets of the game and what those players are doing. And you can see some pretty obvious shifts in how people are building even pug groups in Group Finder based on MDI performance or recent MDI class representation. I think I saw the most obvious example of this on my alt Hunter, because who doesn't have an alt Hunter, right? And I was pretty well geared and I was pumping because Hunters pump, but like I wasn't getting invites into Mythic Plus groups even remotely as easily as my rogue. My rogue I could queue up no problem, just like Undad was saying. And then MDI happens and everyone's running, triple BM Hunter comps, and then all of a sudden I get invites instantly on my Hunter. Every time when I get queued, instant invite. So I think it definitely trickles down even to the more like casual meta and casual Group Finder stuff.
Do you guys think this obsession with the meta is a bit exaggerated, though? Do you think it's a problem oftentimes? I mean, you guys don't have it as hard, right? I mean, the Hunter example that you just gave, Koji, is maybe a glimpse for you into that world. But as rogues, everybody goes gaga over you guys to get you in M+ groups. But, some people aren't so lucky, depending on the class and spec they're playing. In reality, though, and even akin to these kind of unique buffs, debuffs, utility that people bring, oftentimes you don't really need them, right? Unless you're pushing some definitely higher content. So do you think this kind of obsession with the meta is hurtful towards the community? Is it something we can even really fix, truthfully? What do you think, Undad?
I think it kind of just is what it is. I don't know that you're going to change an entire community that's developed over 15 years to think a different way about the game, So I think I don't know what the solution is. I think adding more things into dungeons, like Covenant-specific buffs, is probably not the route to go if you're trying to soften the blow of this community issue. But I don't know. I don't think you can change it. I think you give more classes whatever seems to be the OP utility for dungeons and let it work itself out that way is honestly the best solution in my eyes.
All right, Mystler?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing. I have no suggestion how to fix it. It's certainly over-exaggerated, but I think it's also a kind of natural community thing that you cannot really avoid.
Koji, what do you think?
Yeah, it's hard. I've played MMOs for a long time, and I think this stuff just kind of naturally happens because the community drives a lot of feedback among itself and kind of gets into feedback loops. I played Feral for 2 years. And so I do feel the pain of the non-meta class spec combo. So it's hard. It's hard. Like I remember when I was playing Feral last, I was it was HFC. I think I was currently ranked 23rd all-star or something, and even I couldn't get group invites to challenge modes and stuff like that. It's hard. Got to find a group, make a group yourself.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest factors is definitely that social aspect that helps ease the blow for some of the meta obsession, at least in a pug world. But let's we derailed a bit, and it's not a bad thing, but let's get this train back on the tracks towards SL stuff, Shadowlands specific. So let's talk about some of the major rogue and rogue spec changes that we saw moving into Shadowlands, so we can kind of paint the full picture of where we really stand and what to expect going into Shadowlands. So, unfortunately, off the top of my head, I don't remember an exhaustive list, but I know, as even Undad mentioned earlier, Slice and Dice is baseline rather for all of the rogues now. We had a redesign on Roll the Bones for Outlaw. Some recent changes, which Mystler, I'll let you get into for sub. Quite a few changes actually compounding now for sub over the course of alpha and beta. And I don't think Assas got too much. You guys will definitely have to correct me on that. But Mystler, why don't you get the ball rolling with these changes, especially in the sub aspect of things?
So there's a couple of changes that were more generic and affect all specs. Which is a Slice and Dice that we already mentioned. So Sub also has Slice and Dice back, but it's not just Sub, it's also Outlaw having it as a baseline now, as well as Assassination having it, where opinions can differ depending on spec. I guess we can touch that for Assassination later on when we talk more about Assassination. Something that also all specs got is they got Shift back, which is a utility thing, which kind of double functions as a DPS thing for Assassination, also something we can touch on later. Then we got Poisons, which matters for Outlaw and Sub again. Poisons are back, which I mentioned earlier that I was a big fan of this fantasy rework that they did in Legion. So I never had a problem with Poisons being gone and doubling down on the Shadow thing of Sub. And now Poisons come back, but it's not something I mind very much either. So I can understand that Poisons are seen as a very iconic thing to the entire class. So I can understand them coming back. Right now, Poisons are a little bit strange though. I saw some question marks open there because for Sub and Outlaw, only auto attacks can trigger them. So they have virtually no impact on the specs whatsoever, except that you have to press them every 60 minutes and need some weak aura to track that and not forget it. So that's very interesting. Otherwise, I guess the main impact of Poisons being back is the non-lethal poisons with the slow on crippling poison and numbing poison and Shift now serving as the cast delay / enrage spell, which may be interesting. It's I guess even more utility. Then let's focus a little more on sub changes in particular. Nightblade is gone. We got Rupture back, which functions still as the maintenance bleed that you keep up on the target. But I think this is a very positive change, even if it goes back on Shadow Fantasy, since Rupture has a longer duration. That was something that was a little bit I don't want to say annoying, but weird about the spec, yet you had to refresh Rupture so often, and Nightblade so often, and Rupture kind of fixes this and makes it a period that is that I think fits the spec a lot better. The second part to it is that Nightblade had a damage amp on it, so whatever target had Nightblade on it, you dealt more damage to it, so you had to, it required some ramp up, you couldn't just you needed to put it up to do focus damage, basically, and that part is gone. So I like that Rupture in a way feels a little bit more optional. So if a target doesn't live for long because you have AoE trash packs that you can cleave down very quickly, or because you are just in world content and fighting some enemy there, you don't have the urge to put it up for that damage amp that is on it. You can just it's only a bleed again, and I think that is a very good and easier to grasp thing compared to Nightblade. And ultimately with Slice and Dice being back and Rupture instead of Nightblade, the time you spend doing maintenance fissures to keep all this up doesn't really change because of the new timings. So I think this is a net very positive and cool thing. Then Sub got Find Weakness as a baseline thing. It was a talent, but now, just like it was in Worlds of Drona again, it is a core passive again. But it functions a little differently in terms of the timings. Back in Worlds of Drena, there was a lot of gameplay revolving around using your ambush and Shadow Dance to maximize the uptime on Find Weakness. That is not something that, at least with the current numbers on beta, we see return. They added several rank 2s to your main rotation spells that allow you to basically reach 100% uptime without playing much around Find Weakness. So currently I would say Find Weakness is mostly a flavor thing that is returned because it was a thing for Sub a while ago. and that you more passively keep up. It's not something I mind personally, even though I understand when people say they want the old Find Weakness gameplay back. But yeah, right now I think everyone should see it just as a flavor thing, at least until we get some word from Blizzard on what the intended numbers here are. But it's 100% uptime, basically. Another interesting change I should mention for sub is that there's a new baseline finisher with Shadow Vault. And it's also something I think is a good idea. Because it adds a decision that sub didn't really have as a baseline thing before, as in that you can now basically decide to whether you spend your damage combo points on Eviscerate and funnel all that damage into your priority target and just keep that niche that we already always had, versus you can just decide to use Shadow Vault for AoE damage and commit to the AoE damage on trash packs and dungeons, for example. At least that's the theory. There's also some question mark with that due to bugs. We have a lot of bugs on beta. So I'm curious to see how that will happen. Currently, Shadow Vault damage is, at least the baseline damage, is very, very low and has almost no impact. And then there's this component that it deals additional damage when you have Find Weakness on the target. And that is not scaling with combo points, even though the tooltip suggests it should. And this leads to a weird damage distribution that kind of all of the damage of Shadow Vault is currently in that additional damage. So the way Shadow Vault currently works is a little bit weird. It also has the aspect that it locks your position. So you cannot move like Whirling Dragon Punch for a short time, which can be weird if you want to keep up with some trash pack or so. There's some quirks to it, but I think at least in concept, it's a good change.
Well, when you say bugs, do you mean like newfound bugs for new stuff they've added in beta, or some kind of substantial bug that you've had for 2, 3, 4 years now in sub-spec?
I'd say it's mostly bugs with the things that they touched, rather.
Okay.
So things that they changed or things that they added, there's a lot of bugs with those. I think the core is perfectly fine, and there's not much to complain about.
All right.
It's just quirk like that. There is currently... I'm wondering if this goes out of scope, but there's currently an interesting bug that sub, by using Slice and Dice, heals themselves passively every 2 seconds. So you basically just sub rogues heal, I think it's 8% of their max HP every 2 seconds without doing anything specific. And that is some bug that stems from an interesting oversight about a passive that I think Blizzard has forgotten from back in Warlords that is still active but didn't do anything for the last few expansions. So there's a lot of weird quirks like this that I assume they will address at some point. I hope.
You just ruined it for everybody now. Sub could have been the king of everything, indestructible.
It's kind of a good example of like there's some of these bugs that we don't really know what's intended or if they're bugs or whatnot. Like I think if energetic recovery is supposed to be there, it probably shouldn't be as strong as it is, but we don't really know if it's intended to be there or not because, we haven't been told. It's the same kind of around the poisons as well. Like we don't really know if Outlaw is supposed to be able to spread poisons with Blade Flurry. I mean, they used to be able to. I think it would make sense that they could, but we don't really have a clear idea of like if poison's proccing from only auto attacks for sub and Outlaw is intentional or not. So it's kind of this weird gray area with some of the changes.
So that's a really interesting point you made, and I definitely want to sidestep here for a sec because it's a good leeway into kind of a thematic issue that's been happening a lot, at least in some of the specs we talked about, were concerns with lack of communication, specifically though on the class development front, right? Their communication, I always preamble and kind of preface and say this, the truth is for alpha and beta Shadowlands has been fantastic compared to other alpha beta cycles that I've done. I've done so many of them. Some of you guys have. So there's system communication, etc. Getting involved in the community has been stellar compared to anything they've done. But for some reason, the class communication seems to be lacking in the eyes of a lot of people. Sometimes irritatingly so, because as you just mentioned, Koji, there's a lack of guidance on vision, right? Like, what are we trying to do here? Where's this class spec going? Hey, rogues, just so you know, we're doing this. So, Undad, do you feel that rogues fall in that same kind of boat right now, where you guys are a bit confused with, as Koji mentioned, some of the directions of things, some of the changes? Do you think that you need maybe a bit more clarification on what's going on with some of these specs?
I think definitely. I think a lot of the, well, at least currently right now, I think Rogue is kind of being carried by being tuned well and just having a core class that works. So when you don't get communication, it doesn't hurt as much as other classes that don't have like clear goals to begin with. But probably like 50% of the new things that we have just either don't work or work in a way that doesn't make sense given the tooltips, or just have like the numbers that are there are not the actual numbers. For example, to touch on poisons again, we don't know what the situation is, especially with subtlety, because specifically numbing poison spreads with Shuriken Storm. One of the 3 poisons we have access to right now spreads. Nothing else does. It doesn't spread our slaughter poison, which is a covenant ability. We have no idea any communication regarding that. We don't know, like, should I be testing Venthyr in the event that slaughter ends up powerful in AoE that we can spread it, or should I just assume I'm never going Venthyr? Like that, there's no communication. We seem to be like a week or 2 behind all the other classes as far as when we get our stuff as well. Pretty much a build will come out. Everybody got access to legendaries and conduits. We got access to none of those. The next build, we got, I think, like 2 conduits and 5 legendaries. Other specs were finished. So I think a lot of me personally, I'm not super concerned because I think the core class does play well and we'll get there eventually. But I can understand the vast rogue community being frustrated that all these new things are coming out and we have clear directions for other classes, but not at all for rogue.
We also had a weird. Sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna like mention that the poison thing is just like, I think that's an area that definitely needs some clarification. It's been very frustrating, I think, for the community in evaluating any of this. Is like, say slaughter poison, like you mentioned. Sometimes slaughter poison replaces deadly poison. Sometimes it actually lets deadly poison or instant poison stay on. We don't actually know. Are you supposed to have both? Is it supposed to replace? The tooltip doesn't really say. And we've never really gotten a blue post about it, the vision there. Similar, like, are we supposed to be able to run crippling poison and numbing poison at the same time, or are we supposed to have to pick between one or the other? We don't really know. Like right now you can toss them all on. Is that going to stay? I don't know. Maybe maybe not. So it definitely would be good to get some feedback in that area.
I mean, this is also underlined by the only post that we did get at some point. Remember back before the alpha even launched, we got these blue posts on hitting on several classes on what their vision for the new expansion is and what the initial changes will be. And there are things for Rogue that they mentioned in there that we still to this day have not seen. They mentioned something about Pickpocket to buff your Crimson Vial, which was nerfed. We've never seen any pickpocket items that actually do anything like that. That was something that was announced. Then we saw there was something in the announcement about the Toxic Blade coming back to Assassination as a talent that modifies Shiv. We've never seen something like that. There was something about Riposte for Outlaw that has evasion again instead of Riposte to bring that back. Also something we haven't seen. So these little pieces of communication that we did get months back, we've never even seen anything of those, or at least a part of those.
Okay. That's not a good feeling. And I assume, usually kind of devil's advocate things as much as I can, but I assume you guys have given ample feedback and done what you can, and it's really just a waiting game. I mean, we all understand the frustration, right? Even if they don't have... I mean, in the boat of some other specs and classes, sometimes they may just not have anything to share, but at least some people would appreciate a bit of feedback in the regard, like, hey, Windwalkers, we read your feedback, just so you know, it's something we're thinking about, something we're focusing on, just that reassurance. For you guys, you've already gotten stuff, and there hasn't been a word about it, or haven't gotten things they said they would give you, and there's still no word about it. So definitely pretty frustrating there, and it seems to be a pretty big theme that the changes and blue posts, the blue post rather, and the explanations only really come out when changes come out. So it probably is not very fun for you guys to give feedback blindly on something that is maybe not even a direction they're going to move in.
Testing was also weird because, as Undad said, rogues were a little bit behind in terms of development, and I think it was more than a week even. And we had this weird situation that by the time they made the server wipe, where you still could test everything fine with a max level jar, they wiped basically all the jars from the server, and in the very same build on that very same day, we only got our conduits. We had no conduits until that day, and we had one working legendary. So that put us in a very weird spot of having to level to even be able to test anything. Well, thankfully, we got the pre-made realms now with the Torghast realm, so we can do our jobs again. That was very weird. Others could test their stuff, and we didn't get it until the wipe.
Yeah, not the most fun. Let's return back though real quick just to kind of sum up the spec changes for Shadowlands. So we talked about sub Mystler. Koji, anything particular for assassination that changed going into SL to where we are now?
No, not really. I mean, assassination is at its core pretty much exactly the same spec. The toxic blade shiv thing is pretty transparent. If you had a toxic blade macro, you just change it to cast shiv instead of cast toxic blade, and you use it exactly the same way. The main difference is the addition of slice and dice. The problem there for assassination is that slice and dice doesn't do anything for assassination. So it's there, and we cast it, and it increases our white damage, but that's about all it does. Unlike Outlaw and Sub, Assassination doesn't actually get any resource generation from auto attacks at all. Both the other two specs actually have a feedback loop with their auto attacks, where they get either combo points or energy back. But Outlaw doesn't. Assassination doesn't. We have all of our energy regen through bleed ticks. And because Slice and Dice doesn't actually impact it, it's just kind of something you put up. It's kind of low priority. It increases your white damage and increases your weapon enchant uptime. And that's about it. So it's a little disappointing, I think. I mean, I don't think Assassination is in a place where it needed major changes, and that's fine. But I would have liked to see a little more thought go into the Slice and Dice application, either bringing back the older version of Slice and Dice that had like a passive energy regen component on it. And I think going into alpha, a lot of the hype about Slice and Dice was hoping that was going to be the case, because the last kind of known version of Slice and Dice had an energy regen component on it. So I think everyone was like, oh yeah, this is going to speed up Assassination, kind of smooth out some of the early expansion, like low APM stuff. But unfortunately, that they only brought the version of Slice and Dice with, melee attack speed. So it doesn't do anything. And, as another maintenance buff, it actually slows things down more. So I think Assassination is like actually targeting high 30s APM right now on Shadowlands. Something like 37 APM. It's slow, really slow. So I think we'd like to see some stuff there. Otherwise, none of the Shadowland changes are very meaningful for Assassination.
All right. And what about Outlaw Undad? Obviously, Roll the Bones was a bigger one.
Yeah, I think I'll talk about that last. I want to talk about two other things real quick beforehand. Obviously we have the Slice and Dice, which kind of fills the role of what Roll the Bones was. It's our maintenance buff to keep up, and it does increase our energy regeneration through combat potency procs. That feels mostly fine. It's kind of gameplay we're familiar with keeping up a buff. Just kind of fills that slot. Then we also have Between the Eyes, and obviously Blade Flurry that we talked about earlier was changed. Flurry has initial damage done now. We don't know if that's supposed to flurry. That's a bug we're hoping to see fixed, or at least communicated about. And Between the Eyes as well. Between the Eyes is no longer a stun. We have Kidney Shot back as Outlaw as our stun. So we don't just have stuns in our rotation. We have to make a conscious effort to stun things. I think that's a good change. I think a lot of rogues will probably not want it because it was nice to just stun things in Mythic Plus. But I think overall for the health of the spec, I think it's good. But Between the Eyes doesn't function yet how the tooltip says it's supposed to. So it's supposed to apply a debuff to your target that grants you 20% increased crit chance and 20% damage. So effectively like a single target blood of the enemy was baked into it. The crit chance works, the crit damage doesn't. We don't know if that's supposed to be the case or if they're intending to pull the crit damage off. Would like some communication there. We'll see what happens. But then we have the Roll of Bones, which is, I think the Roll of the Bones change from my perspective is fine. The more I play with it, the more I'm kind of just indifferent. I think you'll see feedback from players on Roll of the Bones. The changes, obviously, maybe we should mention that it's on a cooldown now, and it costs 50 energy. So you just kind of keep whatever buff you get, and then 30 seconds later, you roll again if you didn't like your buffs, and that's it. So you're not spending combo points. You're not playing around trying to find the correct buff. You're just kind of existing with whatever buff you have. Most of them are not super gameplay changing. Like, you just kind of have them. There's slight changes with things like broadsides, giving you more combo points, but by and large, you roll every 30 seconds and that's it. I think the feedback from players will range from players at the higher level in Mythic Plus will either feel negative about it or indifferent because they'll feel like they lost some agency over when they rolled. It felt good to when your roll wasn't impactful, your damage wasn't that impactful, to spend that time looking for the correct buff for like an upcoming burst of damage you needed. That felt good to play around when you did it successfully. But I do think that there's a lot of frustration from probably a larger portion of the community feeling like their damage was very RNG dependent. And even though now it'll still be RNG dependent, it feels less bad to be rolling multiple times in a row. So I don't really feel either way about it. I think eventually most rogues will probably feel pretty indifferent about it. So I think the change is fine. I think they could look at the energy cost. I think they should look at the energy cost because effectively we have a Conduit now where when you cast Roll the Bones, you have a chance to reset the cooldown on Roll the Bones. That Conduit, as long as Roll the Bones costs 50 energy, you will never play. It just costs too much. You will never use that Conduit. It will never be a gain because it's too much energy spent for a chance to get a better buff. And a chance to reset it. Like, it's not even a high chance to reset it to begin with. So I think that needs looking at. I actually spoke to Locktark last night, which is he's like our outlaw guy in Ravenholt, about his thoughts on the change. And he was hoping they would add like combo point generation to it if they're going to keep the energy cost. So when you do roll, it's more than just, man, I just got a 4 energy per second buff for the next 30 seconds. This excellent. At least getting a combo point or two, making the button press feel good now that it's not a finisher, is something that I think we're hoping for, and it would make that change positive rather than just indifferent. But overall, I mean, Outlaw play is pretty much the same. It's slightly different in the rolling aspect, but the spec's still good. It has a good flow. You're still reacting to procs. Generally, just positive feeling going into Shadowlands about it.
Just a personal curiosity here. How do you guys feel about Roll the Bones as a thing in this game, and the kind of the power variance between like a crappy 1 roll and a 5 roll? Like, how does that sit with you as a core spec design that could so wildly swing the damage? Koji, I see you smiling about that.
I'm smiling because I've spent probably 50 to 60 hours of my life over the last year looking into reroll logic for the APL and for theory crafting purposes, and it's always terrible and mind-blowing in how unintuitive it is. I think it is a very, very hard mechanic for anyone to wrap their heads around because it doesn't work in a way that most people can grasp in the context of the game. There's nothing quite like it, and it's very unintuitive. Most every time we looked at it closer, the more we look at it, the more we wanted to reroll all the time, just keep rolling, keep gambling. And numerically, it was almost always best to reroll off the terrible ones because they're so terrible. The problem with it is that it feels really bad. It feels really bad to be on a pull and you'd be like, oh, I gotta reroll. Oh, I gotta reroll again. Oh,
fourth, fifth time in a row, you're sitting there re-rolling and you're like, is it really worth it? And unfortunately, the answer is yes, it's still worth it. But you're sitting there for like 45 seconds doing nothing. And it's a very, very bad gameplay loop. I think in that regard, the cooldown is very beneficial in that it keeps players from having that problem. It keeps us as theory crafters from playing the numbers and realizing that just sitting there fishing for buffs is the right thing to do. On the other hand, it does mean that those bad cases are things you're stuck with. So when we get that really bad buried treasure buff that does literal nothing, you're stuck with that for 30 to 45 seconds. And I think that feels equally bad in a different way. And that's probably what Undad was getting at, that, you know, I think feelings will be mixed on there are pros and cons to it. I think the cooldown paired with them doing a tuning pass would make a huge difference. I think if they could make the bad buffs less bad, it would feel a lot better. It would take a lot of the RNG out. There'd still be RNG. You'd still be adapting your rotation, but you wouldn't be in that situation where, like, I'm doing 2k less DPS just because reasons, because that doesn't really feel good, I think, for anyone. And to give people in chat who don't know Rogue, Buried Treasure gives you a energy regen buff that's not modified by anything. And right now it's 4 energy per second. So the ability costs 50 energy to use, and then you get a buff that gives you 4 energy per second and does nothing else. So it takes about half the duration of the buff to even pay for itself, let alone do anything. So it's pretty bad.
Yeah. that doesn't sound very fun. It's like the one thing, you know, coming from old school days, like I said, when I used to main Rogue, it's the one thing that Outlaw has, because, you know, nostalgia hit for combat Rogue back in the day, is the one thing that Outlaw Rogue has that's just not, I don't know, not very fun. Mystler, what do you think about Roll the Bones?
I personally am a little bit positive, slightly better than indifferent about the change that they're making to Roll the Bones with the cooldown, because I think this negative feedback loop of, oh no, I have to reroll, is gone. Even though it's a bit sad that it's only gone because they don't allow you to reroll, basically. What I was hoping for is some more in-depth rework of the buffs that you actually get. Something that I've personally always wondered, I'm not sure if this is any solution or anything, but is to just rework Roll the Bones completely, to focus more on having this kind of RNG aspect that changes your rotation, and to go away from all this not very transparent how it works thing of having the chance to roll 1, 2, or even 5 buffs at chances that you don't know unless you ask a theory crafter or look it up on some guide. And from this idea of having buffs that need to stay up for, well, it was a maintenance finisher, so for the entire time, and they kept the durations and the buffs, to something more short-term with more impact. Like, it could be some impact of a Conduit or a legendary to at least to a degree, something that brings back an effect that when you use Between the Eyes, you get a one-time buff to something. It's just, I'm just making up something now, but really something, you press Roll the Bones, you get one effect, and you react to that effect, and go away from all this preconception of having a set of buffs that is random and that lasts for a duration, and you have to balance around that.
Okay, so the RNG, not the most popular discussion topic amongst rogues. So of some of the major, we'll hop into talents / covenants / soulbinds in a bit, and / legendaries in a bit now, so we can kind of grind through those. But some of the overlying meta issues that were introduced either between BFA, the GCD issue, and now recently in Shadowlands, another hot topic, the AoE capping issue, something that rogues are certainly part of now. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume the GCD thing, not really a concern from rogues, from what I've seen baseline. You have a lot of things off the GCD that make no sense to me, that you have sprint off GCD, but paladins have charger on GCD, things like that. So in the GCD department, I think we're pretty good guys for the most part.
Yeah, I think generally it's fine. I think Vendetta being on the GCD still feels kind of meh, but it's not a big deal. It's every 2 minutes. It's kind of whatever. Feint being on the GCD as a defensive cooldown kind of feels bad sometimes, but you play around it. It's not that big of a deal.
So
I think Vendetta and Shadow Blades are like the only two, and even those are not a huge deal. So
something that was a little bit weird to have on the global cooldown was Blade Flurry, and they made an interesting decision now with Shadowlands to add this instant damage component to it, which I think is an interesting way to kind of solve it, because I always feel like when I press a button that triggers a global, it should also do something immediately. In the easiest case, be an attack that deals damage, and this is what it does to Blade Flurry. It may have the side effect that the damage is currently very high, so you may want to use your basically AoE cooldown on single target. But that's a different topic. But I think justifying the global that way and touching that again is generally a good idea, instead of just having this weird global lying around.
Okay. So some things on the GCD that are inconveniences, let's say, but nothing groundbreaking like Arcane Mage had or Unholy DK still has, that you're sitting there for 15 seconds doing nothing but popping CDs. But something that is more near and dear to you guys is the AoE capping of things. And it seems that not only is there some pretty strict circumstances for the AoE capping, but also different AoE capping between the specs. So Outlaw pretty much hard capped at 5 targets. Sub hard capped at 8 targets for its AoE. And Assassination uncapped, but I'd assume that it's uncapped. What is it? Shuriken Storm is probably pretty weak, or not Shuriken Storm. What do they have? Fan of Knives is pretty weak, and most of their AoE comes from dot maintenance. So how do you guys think the AoE
Fan
capping
is capped?
Yeah, they ninja capped it. It's
Ooh.
not in the It's not in the tooltip.
How much?
It's not in the Crimson Tempest tooltip or in the Fan of Knives tooltip, but it is capped now.
At what?
8 targets.
Is it
8 targets for both? Fan and Crimson Tempest are capped at 8.
Okay.
The only uncapped things that exist for Rogue are Blade Rush, which is an Outlaw talent, typically taken for single target, because Dancing Steel is just the better AoE talent in most situations. And another thing we're not sure is a bug or intended is Secret Tech is a talent for sub, and that has supposed to be 2 hits, but actually has 3 hits involved in the ability. The first hit is capped at 6, and the second and third are uncapped randomly.
I'm pretty sure that is a bug where they just forgot to flag the spells. So the way it works, it's an instant damage attack that you do yourself, that is kept to 6 target, as it says in the tooltip, and then it triggers 2 basically pet clones that also do an attack about 1 to 2 seconds later, and those are not flagged to be target kept. I assume this is a bug they will fix at some point. What I find a little bit weird about this is why they exactly decided to cap that particular one at 6 target, whereas everything else for sub and assassination is 8 targets.
8, yeah.
I assume the logic behind it is that it has this priority damage thing where it deals more damage to the main target. But it feels a little bit arbitrary why exactly they did this, kept this to 6.
And to the greater point, but before you make your point, how do you feel about like 2 of your specs having 8 caps, one of them having 5 caps? Is that supposed to be like a strength for Assassin Subtlety to kind of address the whole, Blade Flurry and Outlaw scene as the kind of cleave spec? Like, what do you think that's, where's the logic there, Undad?
I don't know.
All right, then. I'll see you guys next week.
Thanks for coming. The logic is. It doesn't. I mean, I don't particularly think the AoE cap being as low as it is for any spec is going to be enjoyable gameplay regardless. But I don't know why it's different. I couldn't tell you, especially because effectively assassination being capped at 8 is, I think, the most frustrating, simply because assassination generates its combo points based on crits with Fan of Knives in AoE. So by capping at 8, you are hard limiting the amount of mobs you can hit, which effectively limits the amount of chances you have to crit, which effectively limits your combo point generation in AoE. So that one in particular, I think, feels the worst. Even though Outlaw has the lowest cap, Outlaw just kind of exists, and it doesn't impact gameplay. It impacts the damage you're doing, but it doesn't impact your gameplay loop. And sub being capped above 6 ensures that you're full combo points on a Shuriken Storm, so it doesn't affect how it feels to play. It just affects how much damage you do. And I do want to be sure to say, any developers, if you're watching, if you cap Secret Tech, we'll never take that talent. So please consider what you're doing when you fix this bug. Maybe some numbers tuning involved. But yeah, I don't know what their plan is with the caps.
What do you think, Koji?
I mean, yeah, I'm largely indifferent on the topic. Like, I can find pros and cons to the cap and uncap as long as things are balanced and designed correctly. You know, I like most people doing raid testing, I'm certainly sitting there scratching my head on the Kale Fast encounter and seeing 73 mobs on my screen and being like, why can I only hit 5 of them? I don't know. But outside of that, you get some funny situations with assassination because you can still put up dots. You can still put up your Crimson Tempest. You can still put up your Deadly Poisons. And especially with Conduits and Dashing Scoundrel Legendary, your poisons are going to be doing quite a lot of damage. So you end up doing this really funny thing where you're doing this wiggle, where you're kind of like strafing around randomly while you cast, trying to like get the game to randomly hit things that don't have dots on them already. And it's really bizarre gameplay. It's like you're kind of fishing for luck and trying to micro your position to like maximize how many targets you hit, but it's still highly random. So it feels very weird. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter a lot, but it's definitely awkward.
So you mentioned you kind of see the pros and the cons of AoE capping, and I mean, their main reason for AoE capping is to start to provide a niche for certain people, right? To start to niche and separate AoE versus cleave versus single target more, and have classes and specs that more specialize in those directions. Koji seems to be a bit more understanding towards these, whereas Undad is not so happy with them, especially being an avid M+ player. So, what are your feelings, Undad, towards this AoE cap? If you're trying to be as kind of maybe objective as possible, do you think that they're actually going to achieve this goal in their game, or it's just going to unnecessarily form a rift between caps, AoE caps, KT encounter, unholy DKs doing unlimited cleave on everything, etc.?
I think when we start to see any evidence that they're doing tuning to make it so that the capped classes are better on the target counts up to their cap, then because I feel like that's the niche they're trying to provide, that when you're cleaving, when up to 5 or 8, whatever your cap is, those classes should be better than the classes that don't have a cap. So as soon as we see tuning that demonstrates that is going to come close to happening, then I think a lot of the uneasiness we all feel starts to go away a little bit. I still it's just a personal feeling that I don't think the design goal is one I personally enjoy. Mm-hmm. Maybe it ends up making the game better in the long run, and I'll be proved wrong, and that'll be great. But once we start to see some tuning that makes me feel like they're accomplishing the goal, I'll probably take a little bit of a backseat and not complain quite as much.
Right. Mystler, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Koji put it mostly the way I would put it as well. At first, when I saw these changes and the explanation they gave in the blue post for, which is exactly what Undad also said, that they are trying to make specs more specific for certain amounts of targets. That sounded all somewhat plausible, and I was like, okay, if that's what they want to pull off and they can pull it off, then I'm okay with that. I'm pretty indifferent about it. What makes me very concerned though is when I was testing with Koji's guild, shout out to them as well, and thanks for taking me, when we had the Kelfas encounter and there were so many ads, and we were sitting in voice and wondering, like, did the class developers tell the raid designers that there's a target cap now? And there's also obviously lists going on now with comparing basically what specs have what abilities and what is their target caps, which makes the entire landscape of AoE abilities super confusing. And it also looked, at least when I looked through it, it looked not very consistent. There's still a lot of classes that have things that are uncapped, and it feels weird to me. So I'm super concerned that they are able to pull this off.
Koji?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what they're saying. It's funny. I think what Undad was saying is right too. Like there's a tuning element here that probably hasn't happened yet, and we're just gonna have to hope that it does happen at some point. Because if it doesn't happen, like things how they are right now are very weird, and the balance between target caps and the damage being dealt is not at all sensible. So we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, you're going to start to run into likely an issue then. Yet another factor of why bring X when you can bring Y, right? You know, why bring a hard capped outlaw rogue as much damage as they might do to 5 targets when you can bring. I'll just harp on it again. Not harp on it, it's the wrong word, but like use it as an example again. Unholy DK that can just do crazy amounts of AoE damage, uncapped essentially. So we'll see. I mean, we're starting to enter the tuning phase to a certain extent. I don't think it's too late for some, smaller redesigns, talents, etc. For some of the classes and specs to change, but we'll just, fingers crossed, have to see. Speaking of talents, let's dive a bit in talent talk for the 3 specs. Now, usually we kind of go through it row by row, etc. A lot of the rows are shared between the specs, obviously, like cheat death row, etc. So we don't have to go too in depth for every single one, but I do want to at least move spec by spec and talk about anything notable. Things like, has there been a dead spec here for 2, 3, 4 years now that just hasn't been touched and you don't understand why? Something that's not functioning properly. So we'll start off with Outlaw just because that's the one I'm spec'd into currently. And definitely want to touch on any new talents for Shadowlands, such as, finally, one of your coming soon talents is now here, Dreadblades, Undad. So what are we looking at for the talent tree for Outlaw currently in Shadowlands?
Well, I guess Dreadblades is all we got that's new. I don't think anything else has changed. Correct me if that's wrong, like slight number changing, but
was new.
Retractable hook
to get rid of SND.
Still on the same row, I guess, as Acrobatic Strikes, so that's not going to change. I mean, widely, we're going to play the same thing. Dreadblades is definitely a good addition. I think they need to do some tuning to make it worth playing over Alacrity. That row in particular, I think we have a legendary that if they make interact with loaded dice, our legendary it's effectively Vision of Perfection Major. It's when you have Slice and Dice up, you have a chance to proc Adrenaline Rush. And currently that doesn't function with, currently that legendary is very weird in other ways, but it also doesn't proc loaded dice. So if that gets changed, that gives us other options as far as legendary talent combos. And that becomes probably our most interesting row. There's also potential to finally move away from Dancing Steel or Blade Rush and maybe play Killing Spree with a legendary synergy in Guile Charm, which is the old Bandit's Guile, the green buff, yellow buff, red buff coming back. And potentially using Killing Spree inside red buffs for a damage gain. By and large, right now, it seems like that's not going to happen, and tuning needs to be done before we shift at all away from the talents we've played all of BFA for Outlaw. So I guess we're waiting for tuning, really. There's not too much really else to talk about in that regard.
Is there anything, Koji or Mystler, that you guys want to see? Obviously, everybody kind of blindly says I want to see more things baseline, but realistically, is there anything in this tree that you really think should be baseline for Outlaw rogues, or any talent that just needs a complete overhaul redesign at this point that's so dead? Koji?
I think there's a couple things to mention there. One is Ghostly Strikes needs some massive love. I don't think anybody has taken that talent in the last 8 years or so. It's just bad. It doesn't do anything. It works negatively with the mechanics of Blade Flurry, because the way Blade Flurry works is it flurries the base damage you do, doesn't care about target modifiers. Otherwise, Psychus Phase would be insane. So putting up a debuff on the target actually does nothing. It doesn't duplicate out that debuff damage to any of the flurry damage. So effectively, Ghostly Strike just doesn't do anything. It's too weak. Nobody will ever take it in its current form. We also have, like, Killing Spree, I think, does have potential. I think in the right circumstances, like Undad said, it can maybe be utilized. Right now in BFA, it's actually a DPS loss to use it at all, because you just lose more damage by not using your normal abilities while you're channeling it, because it's so undertuned. But I think it could be good. I think that's mostly a number thing. But as far as the baseline thing goes, I think what Undad said early, as long as Acrobatic Strikes exists, it will be taken. It is probably the best reason to play an outlaw rogue in a lot of situations. It allows you to outrange a lot of mechanics and kind of avoid the melee attacks on AoEs and stepping out of things. It's super good in Mythic Plus. It's super good even in raids. And there is just really no reason that you would ever take something like hit and run over acrobatic strikes. It's just too good. It's too ubiquitous. And I probably would just make it baseline as part of the toolkit for outlaw, and just make it part of the fact that they have guns and whatever, that it's just they're supposed to have this like slight extra range.
Mystler?
Yeah, we've been joking about this in the preamble before the stream already, that it's kind of hilarious that in a way the best talent that outlaw rogues have is a utility talent.
Fair. But otherwise things don't seem too bad. Not too many complaints on your guys' end from a lot of the tree. Obviously tuning can always happen, like Killing Spree is a good example, I suppose, of things that just need some numerical love. I think there's a lot of talents in general across all 36 specs that with just a little numbers love that haven't been paid attention to, they might be competitive again. Anything on here that except for Ghostly Strike, I suppose everything else is okay from like needing a complete redesign perspective?
Yeah, probably. Dreadblades isn't very good. Dreadblades is one of those things, I think Guy and some others had put lots down that was going to be the coming soon. So he's the winner there. A lot of people guessed that one, though. It was, kind of one of the few things that they could bring back. It was the Legion legendary weapon ability, artifact ability. The problem is it just doesn't do much. It's very redundant with a lot of the existing outlaw mechanics. The fact that it maxes out your combo points is not that big of a deal when there's a bunch of Roll the Bones buffs that already make you do that. There's quite a few buffs when you have broadsides going or get Weapon Master procs or whatever, where you already kind of go Sinister Strike Dispatch over and over again during that buff period. So the fact that the Ghostly Strikes or Dreadblades allows you to do that is really not very groundbreaking and doesn't really accomplish anything. And actually, to the contrary, it kind of works against those buffs, because if you're taking Dreadblades and you ever do roll broadside as your Roll the Bones buff, you're just effectively wasting that buff. So I don't think people will take it over Alacrity, which is, I've said on like the previous many shows about Outlaw Rogues, is the most boring talent ever created in the history of mankind. Yet we will still always take it because it's overpowered.
Gotta love those overpowered passive talents that outplay an actually active talent. While we're on the topic, Koji, since you tackled assassination changes historically earlier, why don't you chat with me about the Assass tree, or maybe lack thereof changes moving into Shadowlands for Assass?
Yeah, there's nothing really changing. The only real change was the removal of Toxic Blades, because that got rolled into Shiv, as we discussed earlier. What that meant is that Alacrity poked on through as the kind of rogue baseline middle talent in that row, which I think Mystler touched on earlier. Like in the original Rogue preview, they had talked about adding a Shiv talent, and I think it was maybe possible that was intended to be there. It's probably fortuitous for assassination players that Alacrity is the default talent in that row, because it's super good for assassination to have 10% more haste, because they really like haste and they're really slow. But it also means that nothing else on that row will ever be competitive ever again in the history of mankind. Venom Rush is maybe one of the worst talents in the entire game. It doesn't do anything. And I think people in chat have been asking for somebody to say bad things about Venom Rush for the last 30 minutes or so.
On that note, then, similar to Outlaw, what on this tree, Undad, are we looking at? Do you think maybe should be considered baseline that would help the core of the spec? Anything that's just so dead, Venom Rush, I suppose, that needs to just be redesigned, like rehauled completely? What do you think?
I think definitely Venom Rush. I think also worth noting Blindside was reworked a little bit with the return of Ambush to Assassination. That when you get a Blindside proc, you get a free use of Ambush now instead of a use of Blindside. And the big difference here is that it generates 2 combo points instead of generating 1, which made Blindside just a DPS loss if taken in BFA, because you were You're replacing a mutilate, which could generate up to 4 combo points, with a blindside that generates 1 combo point, potentially 2. So you never took that. So this actually has potential single target now, so that's a good change. Other things to look at is, I think, Master Assassin. We have a legendary now that is Master Assassin, but twice as good. It's 5 seconds and 100% chance instead of 3 seconds and 50% chance. I don't know what their plan is with that. That seems like it's kind of out of place now that we have a different way to just have that effect, but better. So that still being a talent is a little odd to me. And then something I promised Saliathan I'd bring up. He's kind of our assassination one-trick 5-head at Ravenholt. Is they mentioned this Toxic Blade talent. And his idea was to shift Poison Bomb away from being RNG, and just after you shiv, your next Envenom procs Poison Bomb. So this gives controllable AoE, a reason to hit Toxic Blade in AoE, as well as just some single target damage that also buffs from the Toxic Blade debuff that you're applying when you hit shiv. So I promised him I'd mention that. I think it's an awesome idea. Would be a nice change to what is widely a just boring talent now that the impact of Poison Bomb is much less than it was in Legion. You don't see big swings in your damage based on your Poison Bomb procs really anymore. So making it more controllable, I think, is a good move. But otherwise, I think the tree is okay. We'll see uses out of Night Stalker and Subterfuge likely. We'll likely see uses out of all 3 on the first row. Vigor, Deeper Strat, and Mark for Death are often interchangeable depending on different stat levels and whether you're PvPing or not. Level 40 row is generally good. Level 35 is generally good. And with that Poison Bomb change, I think level 50 row is very good. So,
does Master Assassin compound or stack with the legendary or no?
Well, it does, but it just gives you crit chance past 100%, so it effectively does nothing.
The legendary is 100%. So this talent was the talent version of the Legion legendary, and then we're getting the Legion legendary back. So it was like the talent is the nerfed version of the legendary that we now have access to again. So it is very weirdly redundant. I can't imagine there will be much application for it. Like, if there's a place where that mechanic is good, you'll just run the legendary itself. And you'll combo that legendary with Subterfuge and have big crit Garrets instead.
Mystler, anything you want to add for the Assass tree?
I think that pretty much covers it. Yeah, I'm also very happy to see Blindside changed again. And fortunately, it's also working with a new Slaughter Covenant, so that's a cool thing, and I hope to see this more viable again.
Okay.
But otherwise, yeah, I think that's already covered. Something I think is a little bit weird, but I know it has a lot of fans, including me. I think Exsanguinate is in theory a cool thing, and it used to play very interestingly in the past. But I also think it is in a somewhat weird spot, especially with Shiv now being a baseline cooldown. It's you have these 2 relatively short cooldowns that you have to juggle, and Exsanguinate has always become a little bit weird since they added the hasted bleeds in Battle for Azeroth, in the way that it snapshots your haste, which is not very intuitive, and has some interesting tick rescheduling going on there. So I'm not sure going into Shadowlands, that's something that the Assassination mains should judge instead of me, but I'm not sure if it really has that much of an interesting place anymore compared to the previous expansions.
Okay. Since Mystler, it's more your domain, let's move over to Subtlety. Now, this one's, I think, a bit more changes here, including the fact that Pre-Med just came back, I suppose, for lack of a better term, to Subtlety. So why don't you talk to me about the Subtlety tree a bit, Mystler?
Right. There weren't many changes, but finally we got our coming soon talent filled with premeditation. And I think it's a somewhat funny situation that I think in the feedback forums and whatnot, people wanted premeditation back, and in a way they got it back, but not really in the way that they expected. And currently it looks like this is mostly going to be a dead talent from the start, because it really only works with True Stealth and Vanish. And all it does is it gives you a free 10-second slice and dice if you don't have it up yet. And and then 2 combo points when you vanish. So assuming it works correctly, it over the course of a fight amounts to using your first slice and dice a little bit later, and 6 combo points, which is virtually nothing. I've implemented this in Simcraft earlier, and there was almost no visible difference at all for picking this talent, which is a bit sad. It feels like this is supposed to work with Shadow Dance, so that when you enter Shadow Dance, you get the benefit once or so. It's something that really needs communication. Right now, it might just be intended to be, at least that is what the Blue Post suggested, to be a setup thing for solo content, maybe, that you don't have to press slice and dice for quick fights. But I don't see it add a lot of value in raid content, or it could be cool in Mythic Plus, of course, to get slice and dice up quicker. Maybe that's intended. It's hard to say. I find it a bit disappointing in the way how they brought it back and not working with Shadowland. And it has the side effect currently that it also, but I assume that is a bug, that it overrides slice and dice duration. So if you currently in combat vanish and Shadow Strike with premeditation, it will cancel your active slice and dice and reset it to a pandemic 13 seconds, which is a bit frustrating too.
That sounds awful. What I wanted to just jab and pick your brain about is you keep mentioning that pre-med came back in a way that most people were not expecting or didn't want. What were you expecting, or what did you want pre-med to come back as?
Right, okay, I should have mentioned how pre-med used to work. Pre-med used to be an active ability that you use with a cooldown, and that you can use to generate combo points from stealth. So this coming back as a passive that still gives you combo points is a little bit different, so I found that an interesting change. And the original premeditation that only was an active and requires stealth, of course, can be used from Shadow Dance as well, whereas this has no interaction with Shadow Dance, so it's I guess it's a bummer to all the premeditation fans.
Yeah, fair. How does the rest of the tree look outside of the tier 1?
Otherwise, there aren't many big changes. In the second tier, I think, has always been fairly solid, with Shadow Focus being favored for being very smooth for gameplay and the energy management, so that kind of came down to numbers in the end. There's currently an interesting thing going on with Night Stalker snapping Rupture that is back at the full assassination modifier, which I assume is a bug as well, but currently it is actually a beneficial gameplay to snapshot your Ruptures in Dance. But I think generally it's a mostly solid row, even if it comes down to numbers. Same goes for the level 30 tier. I think Vigor for smoothing out energy, especially during leveling, can be interesting, even though it quickly becomes dead after that. Deeper Stratagem for just doubling down on these finishes, and Mark for Death for the sniping gameplay is, I think, a fair talent row. The most interesting row, then there's 2 utility rows. The most interesting row is certainly the level 45 row with a Dark Shadow and Enveloping Shadows. And I have the habit of refusing to believe that Alacrity exists, because as we said for Outlaw already, it is a very, very boring talent, and it's the kind of talent where, at least my opinion, but I'm sure there are people that agree with me, it's the talent that you hope doesn't sim well because you don't want to play it. And in essence, this row has always been about Dark Shadow versus Enveloping Shadows, which is something I touched on earlier for the changes during Legion, where it is about having more powerful dances versus having more frequent dances. Now, the interesting thing going into Shadowlands about this tier is that Dark Shadow is currently looking as if it is going to be a dead talent. I didn't really specifically mentioned this earlier, but Shadow Dance was reworked to not be baseline 2 charges on a 1-minute cooldown and being 3 charges with Enveloping Shadows. Instead, it was changed to be only 1 charge baseline, and Enveloping increases that to 2, which has a couple of side effects that currently don't make Dark Shadow look too good. The Shadow Dance has baseline damage increase on it already, that is 15%, and Dark Shadow only increases that up to 30, so it's not even technically a 30% damage increase for picking it. And this going back to only 1 charge, which may reminisce of Waters of Draenor, but in Waters of Juma, we didn't have the passive Deepening Shadows that reduces the cooldown on Shadow Dance. And this plays into it now so that we kind of end up with the same uptime that we have on Shadow Dance right now. But we do not have the buffer anymore on it. Since it has only one charge, you run into the situation that Shadow Dance is ready, and you want to stack it with your Symbols of Death. And either it's ready before Symbols of Death, and you waste every cooldown reduction that you get after that, or Symbols of Death is ready first, and then you have to kind of delay that for Shadow Dance. This leads to a weird kind of situation in aligning cooldowns, which was not the case before, because you have always had more charges where you have a buffer and you can always pull into. And then Enveloping Shadows, now basically doubling the number of charges that you has a lot of positive feedback loops. You get more finishers, you get more cooldown reduction. It's things that have always been the case before, but they are now more pronounced. And then there's the Akari's Legendary, which effectively doubles the impact of your Shadow Strikes, which completely spirals this in favor of Enveloping Shadows. And with a baseline damage amp, even in AoE, which was Dark Shadow's main reason to pick it before, it's not looking that good currently. So this is a little bit weird. Even though I like the idea of Shadow Dance and deciding between these frequent and not so frequent dances, it has the issue that feedback loops kind of decide which of those two talents is better. And currently there are a lot of positive feedback loops for Enveloping Shadows, but not so much for Dark Shadow.
All right.
It's also a little unintuitive because, stereotypically left row talents, right, are the easy passives. But with the removal of the baseline change, I would argue that Dark Shadow makes the spec a lot more punishing to play because of the cooldown alignment issues and not having that kind of fudge factor of the additional charge. The extra charge is really what made those kind of mini cycles we talked about earlier flow really well. And without that charge, it actually feels kind of really stilted and very punishing if you don't have everything perfectly lined up. So it's probably, for a new player, it's probably easier to just play Enveloping Shadows because it gives you a lot more leeway on your timings.
All right.
It seems almost like an oversight, like that, like the impact of going from no charges, like just a cooldown, to 2 charges is just by nature so much bigger from going from 2 charges to 3 charges. And it was already a competitive row between Dark Shadow and Enveloping in a lot of situations in BFA, and then reverting Shadow Dance back to 1 charge and giving it the damage buff was just enough to make it so Enveloping Shadows is just going to be taken at this current tuning. So that's something that hopefully is looked at, because that gameplay difference, I think, is something a lot of sub-rogues enjoy, being able to pick what you want for different situations. If you want bigger damage in your cooldowns, or if you just want more cooldowns. And currently there's no choice. So hopefully that gets looked at.
Yeah, Dark Shadow kind of sounds like it should be that really thing you pick if you want heavy burst during a dance. And it's not really providing enough of that currently. And something I didn't even mention, which I should also mention, is that the baseline duration of Shadow Dance was also adjusted. It's not 5 seconds anymore, it's 8 seconds now. And that matters more than one might believe on first sight. So just to mention some reference numbers, the expected uptime when you Shadow Dance in your rotation, when you pick Dark Shadow on Shadowlands, it will be roughly equal to what we currently have on BFA Live. Even if BFA Live has 2 charges and Shadowlands has only 1. You can expect roughly the same uptime there and align it with every Symbols of Death. But when you go for Enveloping Shadows, on Live you should have around 40% uptime, I think. And that goes up to almost 50, so that is much more pronounced, the difference there.
Okay.
Should we talk about Akari's here while we're talking about this? How this kind of goes hand in hand?
Yeah.
If you want to poke, yeah. I mean, we'll talk about legendaries later anyway. But if this is a good spot that you want to poke it, go for it for sure.
I think it's good because currently Akari's is a legendary that comes from an old Legion passive on our weapon, where when you Shadow Striked, a ghost appeared and did shadow damage, and that was it. It was just damage. So they reintroduced this as a legendary, and currently it reads, when you Shadow Strike or Cheap Shot, you also Shadow Strike again at 100% effectiveness. And there are two things happening with this that we don't know if they're intended or not. They're not how it used to work, but obviously this is a new ability, so maybe it's intended to be different. It's generating combo points. So effectively every Shadow Strike is generating 4 combo points instead of 2. And it is also has a bug where it's double dipping somehow on the crit buff from Symbols of Death. So when you activate Symbols of Death, your next builder always crits. You have 100% crit on your next builder. And from what I've seen, at least, say you Shadow Strike, and then before the ghost hit happens, you Symbols to activate the crit on it. It doesn't consume the buff and also does double damage and then crits. So it does quadruple damage on the Akari's hit, and then your next Shadow Strike obviously crits as well. So what this means for Enveloping Shadows is you are just in Shadow Dance. You are constantly in Shadow Dance because you are effectively doubling your combo point generation by wearing this legendary. So this widens the gap even more. This is also why Subtlety, the last week of raid testing, has looked insane compared to, like, even in some cases being like 1,000 to 2,000 DPS ahead of the next spec, like the second place spec being that far ahead of them. So the hope is that they fix this quickly and then can tune the spec around it instead of waiting until raid week and Sub has another situation where we get over nerfed in Heroic Week because of something that is out of tuned and could have been fixed in beta. So that's, I don't want to, like, I do want to murder this legendary, but I want to murder it so that Sub can be good this tier rather than so it can be bad. So I'm sorry to all the rogues paying attention out there, but this needs to be done.
Yeah, I think Akari's is cool, but it has a lot of feedbacks and synergies as well there. Not to mention that it also synergizes and works with Weapon Master. So currently you already end up doing a lot of Shadow Strikes anyway with Enveloping Shadows. And then you have the repetitions of it with the Akari's Legendary, and then all of that again can Weapon Master and strike again, and everything of that generates combo points. So you end up with so many Shadow Strikes, it's pretty nuts.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, we're looking to the spell data when we're doing Simcraft implementation, so we know kind of how they set it up. And, they've set it up in a way that the damage portion is tunable. So, like, the percentage of damage it does is theoretically tunable. They've set the value to 100%, right? Probably with the idea that can be the tuning knob. But they, I think, massively underestimated the impact of the combo point generation. I think it's actually, I don't think it's a bug. I think it's just an oversight. The way that additional procs work as rogue basically across the board, across all specs, is that they do generate combo points if it flurries the main ability again. That's something they changed about Weapon Master some time ago as well. But they just underestimated it. They underestimated the feedback loop with Enveloping Shadows, and the fact that it goes from basically a 40-odd% uptime to like an 85, maybe 90% uptime due to one legendary is kind of insane. So I feel like and because that aspect is not tunable, as far as I can tell, I think they're just going to have to find some way of like just removing the combo point generation completely. The combo point generation is worth like 60% of the value of the legendary. So even if they set the Shadow Strike damage multiplier from 100% to 20%, it would still be the best legendary.
Well, you two are solely responsible for gutting Subtlety for the rest of the expansion. I hope you're happy with yourself.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds... I think oversight is the polite term to use on that legendary based on what you guys described. Before we move away from talents, anything you want to note on the 50 row for Subtlety? Anybody? Or is it just kind of like whatever?
I think the 50 row is generally fine as well. Master Shadows is usually the single target pick, and makes just energy generation more smooth, but I think that is fine. Secret Technique is, I think, still fine, even though you can make a point asking about how much of a purpose it still has now that Sub has Baseline, Eviscerate as a single target finisher, and Shadow Vault as the AoE finisher. Secret Technique is now basically combining both into one, which I guess is okay you could possibly also achieve that by using a passive talent there instead. I'm not sure. I'm pretty indifferent about it, but it has at least been a very cool talent to play with in the past, and so I don't mind if that stays and is tuned well, so that you can maybe use that as a AoE damage option in Mythic Plus, where you also benefit from the priority damage. Shuriken Tornado is an interesting one going into Shadowlands now as well. So far, it used to be our priority damage thing. Basically, Zool was Shuriken Tornado and almost only Zool to get all these Shuriken Storms for our Eviscerates. Now that we have baseline the Shadow Vault AoE finisher, that I think opens Tornado up to be a little bit more flexible in terms of situation and not bound to be a priority damage talent, so that you can also just use it to spam your Shadow Vault with the Shuriken Storms that it does, so that you have the decision, do I want to use this for prior damage as before, or do I want to use this for AoE, which I think makes us a little bit more interesting and flexible, so positive about that one.
Okay.
Should we talk about the bugs on this row?
Hit me up. I love hearing it. Ammo.
So two things. Secret Technique is supposed to have its cooldown reduced when you spend combo points. Currently, if you spend combo points on Shadow Vault or Slice and Dice, it doesn't matter. It doesn't do that for you. It just, I guess because they're new spells to Subtlety, they haven't been whitelisted or something to make it so that it affects the CDR and Secret Tech. Also worth noting that Secret Tech will very quickly become never taken if they don't do something to address our shadow damage scaling on finishers. We have a Conduit that causes us to do, right now, 30% more shadow damage. There's a buff we keep up with a feedback loop of spending our finishers every 5 seconds. So both Shadow Vault and Eviscerate, which are our other two damage finishers, have a shadow damage portion to them. So they will scale with that Conduit. Secret Technique does not have that. So if in some form that is not looked at, we will very quickly never use this talent for anything because it just doesn't scale in the same way that the other finishers do. It's already pretty close to not being usable. Still good in like low target cleave, but we're getting pretty close. And then Shuriken Tornado is currently, whether this is a bug or an oversight or whatever, again, a lot of these things fall into this row. We mentioned earlier that Symbols of Death causes your next builder to always crit. Symbols of Death makes all 4 Shuriken Storms from Shuriken Tornado always crit. So whether or not that's intended, because it is technically one builder, like you're hitting one builder, it just happens to cast 4 Shuriken Storms. I guess we'll see. It's up to us to guess if that's a bug or not, but that's how it's working currently. So,
okay.
Yeah, I know Mystler said that he was kind of indifferent about Secret Technique. I would say that I'm kind of more on the side of things that I've been very disappointed that it hasn't really been tuned appropriate, because I really like it. I really liked it in BFA Alpha and Beta. I played with it a lot in dungeons. I think it's super fun. It's basically a fixed version of Death from Above that doesn't fly you into the air and mess around with your positioning and kill you. But the numbers have never really been competitive. Like, it's okay for certain AoE situations, but then it comes out really far behind on single target, and it's just a very awkward ability to take. And I think it's a shame, because I think it's really fun to play with. It kind of further feeds on the micro cooldown cycles and getting that like tight rotation of shadow dances and the lining up your cooldowns into the secret techniques and into the eviscerates. Like, it's fun. It's just unfortunate the numbers really never panned out. But I do agree that like my first thought when they announced Shadow Vault was, why do we have Secret Technique then? Because having 2 AoE finishers seems really weirdly redundant.
Undad, any notes on Secret Technique?
I love Secret Tech, man. I want to play Secret Tech always. I would much prefer to hit that than Shuriken Tornado, especially with Master Assassin being a legendary. It feels real good to open from stealth on a Mythic Plus pack and just have every hit of Secret Technique crit. Like, that feels awesome. So if they can make it so it does damage that is relevant and scales properly throughout the expansion, I'll be very happy. I'm also kind of in the boat where the fact that Shadow Vault is capped at all, I don't know why they added Shadow Vault while capping it, because it's going to be very small use case, I think, without being just doing way too much damage, given that it's capped and Eviscerate is like our priority damage, which already is a massive amount of our damage, scales in the same way that Shadow Vault does through Mastery. So I thought that maybe Shadow Vault would do less damage but be uncapped, and then Secret Tech would be better for like small target burst. That could have been a good direction to make there be a difference between the two, because otherwise there really isn't. It's one's going to do more damage than the other, and you hit that one, and that's it. So,
all right. Solid overview of the 3 trees. Doesn't seem like, I mean, everything's relative. Everybody obviously wants all their trees fixed up and stuff. For the most part, it seems like okay, your trees, right? Like, you definitely have some gaps, some concerns with some talents. It seems at least 1 or 2 talents per tree are kind of dead, need some redesign. Others need some numbers tuning. Interested more to see once we get to the legendary section, if there's any other legendaries, because you mentioned some of them play into some of the Assassin tree, if I'm not mistaken, pretty well. But let's move over from that and talk about Covenant. So I'll be that dude, like I like to say in Twitch chat. What's the best Covenant? Now, numbers change, like numbers aside, because numbers are going to change. We need to always discuss these things from a mechanical standpoint, right? And based on some of the notes you guys added, you know, it seems to range everything from Necro is king to, as you guys said, Kyrian did a dev that's played Rogue design this. So things not looking so good, pretty polarizing differences here. But Mystler, what do you think as far as the Covenant mechanically are concerned? I'm not talking about Soulbinds and everything, just their Covenant abilities.
Covenant situation is very interesting. I think we have one Covenant ability that is solid in my opinion, which is the Necrolord Bone Spike. And I think I've heard the point that it can be boring because it doesn't have any interaction with the Rogue or Spec toolkits. But I think that ultimately is what it makes, what allows it to be balanced and tunable and work for all specs. And it has a kind of interesting gameplay on its own. It has a very interesting range with 30 yards that you can use it on. It has 3 charges. It has a cooldown reset effect if the target dies or is healed to full. It has gives you some additional combo point generation. I think it is interesting to play with, both in single target and AoE. It has some value, so I think that makes overall for a fairly solid Covenant ability. Whereas all of the other 3, they have issues that they are either completely underwhelming, don't really fit the Spec toolkits, or are just impossible to be balanced due to interactions with these Spec toolkits.
So do you think, Koji, some of these are just straight up poorly designed, and that kind of by default makes Necrolord the best?
Yeah, and I think we talked in the pre-show, like, we're kind of hoping that's the case. I think a lot of people are, that Bone Spike ends up being the best because it is the most flexible for the reasons Mystler mentioned. Right now, it is doing too much damage. There are some bugs associated with it where it's triggering a 200% AP spell that it almost certainly should not be triggering. That's one of the older iterations of Bone Spike. And that's kind of inflating the damage by probably almost double in AoE situations. But putting numbers completely aside, I think Bone Spike plays really fun. Like Mystler said, it's the cooldown reduction, kind of sniping enemies to get resets, to like optimize damage, combo point gen on other targets. I think it's cool. But the other ones are very inconsistently designed. The anima charged combo point mechanic is not fun to play around, nor does it at all have the payoff that I think somebody somewhere thinks it does. Like, it sounds really cool that, you can use a 2 combo point finisher or 3 combo point finisher and have it be a 7 combo point finisher. Wow, that's pretty awesome. The problem is it's a really long cooldown, and you look over the course of the fight and it generates, 25 combo points. It's like a 10% increase in your combo point gen. And that's actually not that much. So it only ends up being like a 2 or 3% DPS increase, and it's like a pain to use. You have to be watching your combo points and tracking all these buffs in the icon or whatever, and there's no payoff. It also kind of has this weird element where it only affects the damage portion of things. So like, say the eviscerate damage is increased to 7 combo points, but the mechanics that we have that are, say, like you have an X% chance per combo point spent to do something, don't scale. So then we use the energy to use, say, a 3 combo point finisher, and we only have a three times chance of, say, refreshing Alacrity instead of a 100% chance. So it's kind of awkward in that way, and it's hard. It seems intentional because the tooltip does specifically reference the damaging component, but it makes it very one dimensional, and it just doesn't have much value. The attack itself is also just really weak, but that could be tuned. But I just think there's no real payoff to the combo point mechanic, and that makes it very hard for them to tune. They could I think there's some anima power in Torghast where it has like a value worth 20 combo points or something instead of 7. And I popped that into Simcraft just as a curiosity. That makes it almost competitive. So like it's just not as good as it looks on paper to somebody.
A lot of these for some of the pure DPS talents, pure DPS covenants and classes combos. I know we focus pretty much mostly on PvE. It's a PvE oriented show, but I gotta ask. I mean, with how polarizing and kind of crappy you guys are making it, the other 3 out to be, do you think there's any like PvP implication? Maybe they're really good for PvP or something, Undad, or is it just they're all just kind of dead in water?
I think PvP has potential. With Slaughter has potential just from the healing leech that it provides. So it's effectively a Mortal Strike effect, but you get the healing as the rogue instead of just reducing the healing your enemy takes. So that definitely has some PvP implications. I think Bone Spike is likely to be pretty good in PvP as well. The dot is removed when they're healed to full. The target's healed to full, but you just get the charge back and you reapply it. So it's likely going to be very strong split pressure. I don't know. We're the first pure DPS class you've had on for this, correct? You've had like a bunch of hybrids.
That's right.
I think that the pain point for Covenants is actually, I think it's going to be stronger for pure DPS classes, just because they've designed these Covenants in ways that there's obvious strengths for specific specs between the different Covenants. So if you're ever a player that wants to play your full class, you just get you're just screwed. Like you have to pick whatever is the most commonly good, which right now is Necrolord, or you're stuck on one spec. So like for example, Night Fae feeds in to Vanish being a bigger DPS cooldown for Assassination. So once that, granted, Night Fae doesn't fully work right now, but when it does,
shocker,
that will it will likely be something that Assassination rogues like to take, but it's something that Subtlety rogues really don't want to take. Or if Subtlety rogues do take it, they're forced into Master Assassin always to get value out of it. Similarly for Outlaw, forced into Master Assassin to get any real value out of that Covenant. And then you have things like Bone Spike, which, while it's overtuned right now and feels strong for all 3 specs, it doesn't fit like the way Subtlety and Assassination flow in AoE, whereas it fits Outlaw. Where Outlaw, when you introduce additional targets, Outlaw generates the same amount of combo points. So sending out Bone Spikes to generate combo points feels good. It fits right in to the way that spec works. Whereas Subtlety and Assassination directly increase their combo point generation when you add new targets. So dropping a Fan of Knives or a Shuriken Storm to spread your Bone Spikes out for less combo points doesn't feel... It actively takes away from the way that those classes or those specs play in AoE. So now you're in this situation where you have to choose which spec you want to play and then choose your Covenant, which I know they've said they're balanced, but I think they're core fundamental like design issues that no matter what the damage is, if they find a way to balance the damage, there's still going to be Conduit or Covenants that feel way better for one spec and really bad for the other 2. And I think that's a really dangerous hill to start rolling down for the course of the expansion.
Yeah, that class restriction has certainly been a pretty contentious point for a lot of different classes. Just kind of, it's funny you mentioned pure DPS, but honestly, just pure DPS or cross roll. I mean, just having those niches that different even DPS specs live in is a pretty jarring experience, and just compounds further the issue of everybody's complaints, or a lot of people complaints of forced covenant choice right now. That's obviously a very hot topic plaguing Shadowlands coming up. Let's deep dive a bit more into covenants themselves. We don't have to spend too much time on soulbinds, because those are pretty set in stone. Obviously, if you want to mention which soulbinds are best, at least within the Necrolord world, which is seemingly where PvE is mostly going to lie for you guys. But I definitely want to more specifically touch on conduits. So Koji, if you want to dive into, well, I mean, any soulbinds you want to mention, any conduits of finesse or endurance that you want to mention that maybe are standout, but specifically the offensive conduits for assassination to start with.
Yeah, I think soulbinds are not stuff that we've looked too heavily into, just because they still seem like they're in a bit of flux.
Yeah,
They've
exactly.
redesigned a few recently. I think for conduits, there are some interesting ones. I think they have kind of very different design principles across the 3 specs. One of the observations I had is that the assassination ones are generally a lot more passive than I think some of the others. Whereas like Outlaw has quite a lot of what I'd consider interactive conduits. They are things that proc additional combo points or reset their cooldowns or give them additional roll the bones buffs, which they're going to react to, things like that. The assassination ones are pretty much like your poisons do more damage. And when you mutilate, your mutilate does more mutilate. You know, like it's not exactly gonna set the world on fire, but they're effective. One thing I would point out is that there's been kind of like a bit of an oversight, I think, on some of these designs, where say like Maim Mangle, which is the assassination one that increases mutilate on targets with Garrot up. You know, it feels like they kind of forgot that they made ambush a thing. So like it feels like something like that should have been extended to be like your mutilates and ambushes do additional damage, because it just kind of is very one-dimensional. But overall, none of the assassination ones are really kind of game changers. One thing I would note that I was talking to Undad about earlier is that assassination has this weird choice that doesn't really apply to the other ones, where there are 2 conduits, and one is very specifically designed for single target by buffing mutilates only, and one is very specifically designed for AoE by buffing Fan of Knives. And that strikes me as being very awkward and very punishing, given this whole like 7-day cooldown on swapping conduits thing. Like, we're sitting there having to make a choice between like, do I want to AoE this week or do I want a single target this week? And that doesn't really seem very cool to me. And I'm just sitting there hoping the other ones are better so that I don't have to make that decision.
Dude, thank God you don't play a multi-role class. You'd be even more upset right now. Yeah, I mean, some of the coolest conduits that I've seen across everything we've talked about, obviously for tanking world as well, have been the ones that add some kind of proc or even just small skill cappy thing. And reading through these assass ones, they are definitely a bit boring. But apparently the note changes a bit, Undad, for Outlaw conduits. Yeah, what do you think about those 4?
Outlaw has some interesting stuff and some pointless stuff. The interesting ones are good, though. The chance to proc additional hits after you proc an additional hit on your Sinister Strike feeds into this gameplay where you can actually play Guile Charm as your legendary, which I referenced earlier a little bit, which is the green buff, yellow buff, red buff from past, I guess, Warlords is the last we had that. So the more Sinister Strikes you hit, the faster you cycle through these buffs, and you end up with a really high uptime on the red buff, which is a 30% damage increase because of the way this works. It's also, you react to it. You want to spend your combo points as you're getting these procs. So that does have some interesting gameplay. You also have, I don't know the names of any of these. Sorry, I just know what they do.
I'm peeking at them as you talk, so don't worry.
The increased chance to proc our mastery, our main gouge, which when Blade Flurry is active, which leads to Blade Flurry further being cemented as a single target ability, which is just an extra button to hit. At first, I was a little taken aback by hitting Flurry on single target and was kind of like, I hope they tune this so I don't have to do this. And the more I play with it, the more it does feel good to just have an extra button to fill in. That does a nice burst of damage and keeps this conduit up. Now, we also have things like Sleight of Hand, which I don't think we'll ever use at any time, given the cost of Blade Flurry, or not the Blade Flurry, of Roll the Bones, and the lack of certain impact on it. So you get to spend 50 energy, and then potentially you get to spend 50 energy again, which may give you Buried Treasure, which now you don't even get the 100 energy back over the course of Buried Treasure. Like, you just lost energy for the 100 you just spent. So the idea, I guess, is cool. It brings you more back to like a decision making on when you choose to re-roll some buffs, like how BFA is played. But with the energy cost existing the way it does, this conduit can't exist the way it does. And then what even is, I've not been playing with our fourth conduit.
The other one is the set bonus from
okay.
It procs the mini roll
Mini
the bones buffs.
This comes back to our buffs not truly being impactful enough all the time, that I think this is another conduit you likely play in your third potency slot, whatever Covenant conduit you're with, just because getting an extra buff for such a short amount of time when the buffs aren't super impactful to begin with, especially because we have another low impact buff now with the change to Slice and Dice. So what was Grand Melee, which was 50% attack speed and Leech, the attack speed moved over to Slice and Dice, and now the way Grand Melee works is your combo points spent just extend the duration of Slice and Dice while it's active. So this is another quote-unquote bad buff that we have that doesn't do much for our damage, so the likelihood to get a lackluster buff off this is even higher now. So two very good conduits, two very bad conduits is the way I'm kind of looking at it right now.
It seems like the two conduits that are bad are hinged off of the poor tuning of Roll the Bones. So it's not maybe the conduits to blame so much as the core ability on Roll the Bones. Not to be outdone, though, Mystler, what about the subtlety world of things on the conduit end?
I mean, for the sub-conduits, I obviously have to start with the elephant in the room, which is the Deeper Daggers conduit. That makes Eviscerate and Shadow Wall increase your shadow damage for 5 seconds. And that one is extremely powerful right now.
It says 30. Did they change it? Is it a typo? It says 30% damage for 30 seconds.
Oh.
Everyone's like, uh-oh.
I think that's the tooltip being broken.
Okay.
It's pointing in the wrong thing.
But yeah, it goes up to 150% at the highest rank.
Oh.
So 150% more shadow damage is quite a big deal for sub, now that they have these additional damage components on Eviscerate and Shadow Wall itself. And this conduit already is active for those spells that trigger it themselves. So the Eviscerate that gives it the buff also already benefits from this increased shadow damage. Yeah, that already makes a lot of sub damage in terms of shadow damage. And not to mention that the shadow damage is a little bit higher than people might think it is. Tooltips on Eviscerate say that it deals 50% additional damage as shadow damage, which can be a little bit misleading because those 50% are of the damage that you would do if the target had no armor. So you end up with somewhere around 60 to 80%, I think even, of the original Eviscerate damage being shadow damage. And that is buffed again by 150%. Basically every time you use the ability by this conduit. So that leads to some ridiculous amounts of shadow damage. And that further synergies with things like if you play for a Gloomblade build, which also deals shadow damage. If you play Slaughter, the Eventhier Covenant ability, which gives you a poison that does shadow damage. The conduit has no kind of whitelist on what it works with. It really works with every shadow damage. That can include trinkets and racials even. So yeah, that's kind of spiraling out of control and is looking very strong currently. I think the other conduits are in the ballpark of being okay-ish. I don't have any big criticism, but I also don't find them super interesting. Personally, I'm not too much of a fan of Perforated Veins, which stacks a buff for your next backstab that you do. I always think of backstab as this filler that you use when you currently have no shadow dances or anything to do, and I'm not too impressed by something that buffs my filler that by design I want to use as little as possible. So that's a bit weird. It also works weirdly currently because it stacks up to 3 times, and also the damage buff stacks up. So that's a little bit unintuitive, and we're not really sure what is supposed to be the case there. And the other two are one that makes Symbols of Death simply increase your critical strike chance, which is okay. More critical strike chance, I'll take it. It has a good numbers, but it really is what it comes down to, numbers in the end. And then there's Stiletto Staccato, which makes your Shadow Technique procs reduce the cooldown on Shadow Blades. It's pretty straightforward ultimately, and depends a lot on the impact of Shadow Blades. Shadow Blades is not really what we'd consider a very powerful cooldown currently as sub, so this has only little benefit currently in reality. So yeah.
And any notables from you guys for the Covenant potency slots? The 4 that exist, 1 for each Covenant?
Mostly they're really weak, except for the Slaughter one, which is just insanely strong. And to explain a little bit of why that is, Slaughter is a very weirdly designed ability in that when they made it, they basically took Ambush and Deadly Poison and stapled them together, renamed them, and changed it to Shadow Damage. They do exactly the same coefficient, like the Slaughter instant damage has all the same stealth requirements as Ambush, same attack power coefficient, all that. Same with the Poison. It's the same ticks, the same instant as Deadly Poison. What that means is that baseline Slaughter does absolutely nothing for Assassination. It is a 0 DPS increase because they already have Deadly Poison and they already have Ambush, and Slaughter does exactly the same thing. Where that gets a little wild is that the Conduit is very strong. The Conduit basically massively increases the crit chance and damage of the Ambush portion if the poison is active. So anything after the first use. And it's worth noting that this buff does carry over between combat right now. So like if you wipe, you probably have the poison buff at the start of the next pull as well. So you'll have it in your opener, which is also pretty strong. This like is a game changer because it suddenly makes it go from this is a 0 DPS increase to, okay, we take Blindside, which lets you proc the ability to use Ambush during the fight, which also applies to Slaughter, that is now like doing double damage because of the Conduit. So all of a sudden it goes, having Slaughter goes from 0 DPS to like, I don't know what it is, 16% DPS increase or something like that, just from one Conduit. And to me, that feels like massively too binary. It's like, it's just kind of weird. It's also like a weird situation that Outlaw can't take advantage of because Outlaw just doesn't have the ability to spam that ambush portion like the other 2 specs do. Basically only has vanishes, and even though Outlaw has cooldown reduction on vanish, it's still only every minute and a half, something like that. Whereas like if Sub wants to build a build around spamming Slaughter, they can use Slaughter 80 times per fight instead of 5. So I don't see how they possibly can balance that Conduit the way that it's currently designed.
Okay. But you still won't take Venthyr anyway, right? Just for that reason, unless you're
yeah, I mean, that it puts us in a really awkward spot, right? Because it is potentially very, very good with the Conduit maxed out with certain builds and specs, and then it's complete trash for everything else. So like we might be in a situation where we're quote unquote forced to take it because it's really strong. Maybe we need the damage for, raid encounter progression rating or whatever, and then we're just sitting there sad outside of raids the rest of the time. Sad dad.
Well, I mean, just switch back and forth. It's fun. between your 3 teams that you've made.
I think they're just too polarizing. Is the theme here? Is that they all have potential to be cool abilities and fun to play with and great, but they're too polarizing and they function differently for each spec. So it makes you make an impossible choice if you're interested in playing more than one spec. Fair.
I mean, certainly a hot topic right now, right? Relating to everything to do with Forced Covenant choice. Any notables for endurance or finesse, like any utility or defensive things that you're like, oh wow, this is gonna break some things later, or is it just mostly standard stuff?
There is one that lowers the cooldown on Cloak of Shadows when you interrupt. That could be pretty huge. It's not hard to think that could be very good in PvP, obviously, but having certain raid encounters where you could interrupt and soak stuff much faster, like it effectively almost halves the cooldown of Cloak of Shadows if you're interrupting on cooldown. So that one could be pretty big. The others are kind of standard fare, I think. I don't know.
Which
Recuperator could be very strong. Recuperator in the endurance row, particularly for subtlety and PvP, taking Soothing Darkness with it, we could end up in a place where sub-rogues are just unkillable. They're just elusive and also heal for an insane amount just passively by being in Shadow Dance. This is also going to be utilized likely in PvE for the other specs as well, just as like natural sustain. Without, I mean, it helps counteract the nerf to Crimson Vial by giving rogues a way to sustain. But I think the point of contention is likely how good is it in PvP versus, like, I don't see it being busted in PvE content, but it definitely has potential to be oppressive in arena.
All right. Let's turn our sights then on legendaries. Now, we already kind of chatted a bit about this earlier, but since we're on the topic of, since you've been talking more at least about Outlaw, Undad, anything stand out from an Outlaw perspective for the legendaries?
Well, 2 of them work.
Okay, that's a good start.
One of them works.
Not as good start.
One of the Outlaw specific legendaries works. That's the Guile Charm, which I've referenced before. Has some nice synergies with other stuff that exists in the Conduit tree and the base kit and everything. So that's obviously a good legendary. We then have Concealed Blunderbuss, which I hope doesn't work as intended. Again, we don't know. This makes it so when you get an additional hit on your Sinister Strike, you have a chance that your next pistol shots 3 times. And currently, at pistol shots 3 times or until you run out of energy, because all of the pistol shots cost energy and don't all benefit from our other pistol shot buffs, like we get from the passive buff to getting that double Sinister Strike as well as the talent Quick Draw. So praying that is not how this is supposed to work, and this will get changed in some way, that the bonus pistol shots don't consume energy and also benefit from buff, or at least one of those 2 things. Both of them feel real weird. Greenskins, which is the bracers from Legion redone, as well as effectively the Deadshot trait from BFA, just doesn't do anything. There's no buff to get. It doesn't work right now. So that'll feel nice to play. It'll feel similar to when you hit between the eyes, your next pistol shot is buffed. But that doesn't currently work. And then we have Celerity, which may be the weirdest one of all of them in how it's bugged. So Celerity is what I mentioned previously, which is Vision of Perfection Major, effectively. When you have Slice and Dice up, you have a chance to proc 3 seconds of Adrenaline Rush, which is Outlaw's cooldown. Currently, you get 4 seconds of the buff, as opposed to 3. It works in all 3 specs. It's only playable for specs that aren't Outlaw right now, because when it procs, it resets the cooldown of Adrenaline Rush back to its original 3 minutes. So you'll never get to hit Adrenaline Rush as long as you have this legendary on. So if this gets fixed, I could see potential to use it, because it is a nice Vision of Perfection Major was used periodically in BFA. It was actually something we actually used in MDI for whoever we put on explosive duty. We just took them off Blood of the Enemy, and we're just like, you might not get to burst properly, so you're playing Vision of Perfection and you're hitting explosives. Sorry. The other rogues will do the damage. You're on explosives. So having this in the game is fine. It feels good to play with. I think it actually has more potential for assassination right now than for outlaw, though, which I'm sure when we talk about the assassination legendaries we'll get to. And then 2 of the generics have potential for outlaw and also a sub legendary. Like outlaw is just trying to use all these other legendaries instead of its own. Master Assassin is obviously powerful among all the specs. It's the 100% crit legendary we talked about. This one actually works, so that's cool. And Outlaw gets to vanish a lot with the way that Restless Blade's CDR works, so that has potential to be very good in dungeons. Eventually, Invigorating Shadow Dust will work, which is another one of our neutrals. Right now, we have a guy in the Ravenholt Discord, Hashadino, who loves this legendary and has been testing it extensively and wants to only use this legendary for the entire expansion. But it currently affects 2 abilities across the entire class. It affects Symbols of Death and Shadow Dance. And the way it works is when you vanish, it's supposed to reduce the cooldown on your abilities by 15 seconds. But only those 2 abilities does it work on. It works on nothing for Outlaw. It works on nothing for Assassination. So we don't really have any testing done on that to see how impactful it'll be. And then the Subtlety Legendary Deathly Shadows, which gives you a damage buff when you vanish. Outlaw actually benefits the most from this because it vanishes the most often. And it doesn't have other things it's trying to vanish for. Like, it just feels okay to, I hit vanish, I gain 5 combo points, and I do bonus damage for 10 seconds. Great. So Outlaw has a lot of choices. Obviously, a lot of them don't work yet, so it's hard to say what we'll be using. Most of them have gameplay altering mechanics that feel good to play with. Some of them don't, which I guess is okay. I wish that all of them did, but I think that might be a little bit too wishful thinking. Sometimes it's good to have some passive stuff. But generally positive feeling from Outlaw as far as legendaries go, aside from the bugs, obviously. All these bugs we hope are fixed soon so we can actually see what throughput feels like.
Yeah, well, I mean, tuning faves, right? We're on that now, so they hopefully they just sit down for one of the beta builds right now and just do nothing but hash out legendaries. I can already think of a bunch for tanking as well that are kind of, well, not working properly at the moment. In the world of assassination, Koji, kind of had a little sneak preview there already, but what are we looking at here?
Yeah, I mean, to touch on that topic a little bit, Rogue's in a very odd spot with the crossover where we have a bunch of shared mechanics, so even though they have flagged a bunch of legendaries as being for a given spec, we're not restricted to that right now. And that's, for the best, because some of the crossover ones are really good. The adrenaline rush procs are very good for assassination because assassination plays super slow, and that energy regen is very valuable. So that one's pretty cool, and it actually makes Slice and Dice do something. I know I talked about how it doesn't do anything before, but once you staple adrenaline rush procs onto it, turns out that's pretty cool. Likewise, I'd say one of the generics, the tiny finger blades or whatever weird name it has at the top, basically is really only an assassination one. That one has virtually no benefit for non-assassination. I guess maybe sub could take advantage of spreading like rupture when they're abusing the Night Stalker bug, but once that gets fixed, it won't be as good. But that's actually pretty useful potentially for assassination if you're spreading, a huge buff rupture off your opener or something like that, maybe. Otherwise, the assassination ones are primarily pinning our hopes on the Dashing Scoundrel, which is really strong. It basically buffs all of your poisons and then gives poisons energy regen. It's an old set bonus, and it is definitely the most competitive one in a pure throughput way. Obviously, Master Assassin is very good, as Undad said, in dungeons. When you get the re-stealths between packs and you can pop out and do guaranteed crits, that's obviously very strong. But for like sustained damage, Dashing Scoundrel is really kind of a very, very strong assassination option. It will kind of almost certainly be where we're gravitating towards initially. To talk about bugs on this row, because no row would be complete without that. Dashing Scoundrel doesn't quite work right. it has a very funny interaction with the fact they accidentally made Envenom put up a debuff as well as a buff on you. So the crit bonus completely double dips. So you get plus 60% crit instead of plus 30%. And it turns out that's kind of strong. It also has some weird mechanics where tick crits don't cause an energy regen, which we have no idea is intentional or not. Based on the tooltip, we'd kind of expect them to work, but currently it's only the direct instant poison that does the refunds. On the next one, they kind of accidentally reversed the values being used on the that Doomblade trait. So instead of it giving you 5% extra damage per dot on the target, it gives you 20% damage. And that is absurdly broken and very strong, but will be changed, obviously. Clearly the tooltip says what it's supposed to be, and the inverted version is not nearly as strong. But it's pretty funny. I can't see what the next one is on your screen, but
is that Dustwalker's patch?
Oh, yeah. I think the only bug with this is the name, because it should be Duskwalkers rather than Dustwalkers, but I won't be too picky about that. Otherwise, this one actually does function. It's not very good at all, and nobody will ever use it, but it does function. It wasn't strong in Legion. It's not strong now. Lowering Vendetta's cooldown by 1 second is not very useful. It's effectively it effectively ends up being like VOP minor. It's about that level of reduction, and it's just too much of Assassination relies on syncing Vanish with Vendetta. So reducing the cooldown on Vendetta without also reducing the cooldown on Vanish doesn't do anything. And then this one, the Zoldyck's Insignia, it's this was a staple in Legion, the Execute Bracers. It's not numerically better right now than Dashing, but it will almost certainly get used. There will be some boss where, Execute matters. There always is. And this will be strong. We use this a lot in Legion on stuff like Fallen Avatar and Kill Jaden and stuff like that, just because it was good to have that execute damage.
I'm slightly concerned that most of your bugs right now seems to be overbuffing the crap out of all of your specs.
I'll give you this one. Zoldyck's doesn't work on anything other than like 2 abilities. So like most of our poisons and bleeds don't get buffed by it right now. So there's that.
Fair. So, speaking of legendaries that are completely bonkers, broken, and OP, let's talk about sub-legendaries, Mystler, which we already obviously touched on Akari's, but nonetheless there are some other ones to pay attention to, I hope at least.
Right. So starting with the generic and shared ones, Essence of Bloodfang is, I guess, mostly straightforward. It doesn't really synergize too much with the Spec toolkit, so that will come down to numbers tuning in the end. I don't think there's much to say about that. And we obviously have Master Assassin, which I can only agree with what was said before. Is a very potent crit legendary that we've seen, that has seen a lot of playback in Legion, and I expected to see a lot of play in Shadowlands as well. It will obviously be very interesting in Mythic Plus dungeons for sub. So I guess that's interesting to see back. The tiny toxic blades with shift spreading bleeds, that would only affect Rupture in the case of sub. I'm actually not sure how it works with Bone Spike right now. That's something that might be interesting to test, but I don't suspect that to matter since you can hide it.
Yeah, it doesn't work with anything, so we have no idea. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, right. So that's a weird one. I don't expect that to be of any use for sub, unless there really is some shenanigans with spreading snapshot Rupture, but I do not expect that to be the case. Invigorating Shadow Dust, that with Vanish reducing the cooldown, I'm very interested in Hashadino testing that, if there is some way to make this very amazing. I'm not expecting this to be very potent though, compared to the other things that we have as choices. Now moving over to the spec specific ones. Deathly Shadows is yet another Vanish legendary, increasing damage dealt. I think it is fine, and I think numerically, if I'm not mistaken, with our preliminary research and Sims, it will be relatively equal to Master Assassin. It's kind of the same ballpark. Personally, I think we do have, with all the legendaries, kind of overloaded the design space using Vanish. As much as I think something like Master Assassin can be fun, in especially Mythic Plus, I am of the opinion that I personally am going a little bit tired of having Vanish as a DPS cooldown. I think it would be cool to have Vanish just as a utility thing, and now we get basically 3 legendaries that interact with Vanish, and I think that's just taking it a little bit far, and I'm not sure if this is really necessary, and it is something, with 3 legendaries for Vanish, it will come down to one being the best, and that is picked, and that's pretty much it. So I'm not really sure what the direction they're supposed to be. Another legendary for sub is Finality, which just reintroduces an old Legion artifact trait. It is mostly straightforward, just buffing your finishers in an alternating pattern. Comes down to numbers. I think it will be in the midfield, but does not really compete to the top ones currently. And there is the Rodden, which brings back the old legendary, the First of the Dead, giving you making Shadow Strike and Backstep generate additional combo points after Symbols of Death. And I think this is not a legendary that will see a lot of play, that will basically see no play and will be dead from the get-go. Since it was used in Legion, but only for a very, very specific timed scenario in the Death from Above gameplay, where you kind of used your cooldowns into it, which is not the case anymore. It does not really fit the current design in Shadowlands that we're seeing. And otherwise, it's only the additional combo points. If you play something like Weapon Master and your Shadow Strike double strikes, you already end up with the combo points and end up wasting combo points on the run. So I don't see this legendary being very good. Yeah, and the last spec-specific one is Akari's Soul Fragment, which we had before, is currently very, very strong.
It's heading to Nerf Town, I'm afraid.
Yes, everything. I think so too.
But
I should mention Finality is also bugged. Just in case developers in the chat, please fix our legendaries.
Right.
The Eviscerate buff you get, and it just disappears with whatever your next ability is, and it's gone. And Shadow Vault just doesn't apply the buff at all. So it only works on Rupture right now. Please fix it. We want to experiment.
Well, hopefully soon.
Yeah.
I got to say, one nice thing that you guys have is obviously like Akari's is overbuffed. Some just aren't working. But at least conceptually, you have a lot of, as you mentioned, cross-contamination between legendaries, including functioning ones from the general pool. So, I mean, you have a lot of choice, it seems, for different circumstances, which is awesome, because some other classes and specs are legit just bottlenecked into one, and that's it for forever. So that's a nice thing that rogues have going for them. So we've painted the picture entirely at this point, right? Quite in depth about where rogues stand right now on beta. And unlike some of the other shows we've done so far, it doesn't really seem that there's too many holes in your core gameplay for a lot of the specs right now. Obviously, like Koji mentioned, some low APM on a SAS side that could be hopefully countered with Dashing Scoundrel a bit once it starts working properly. Do you guys feel that the Shadowlands systems coming forward to you, legendaries, Soulbinds, Conduits, and even, I guess, the Covenant ability itself, do you think these work well with the Rogue spec toolkits? Do they fill the gaps of any weakness that the Rogues might have? Obviously, some of them don't work, but conceptually speaking, are we looking to have a nice kind of fleshed out full spec moving forward here? Koji, what do you think?
I think it's a bit hit or miss. I think largely I'm mostly happy as long as the numbers are there. I do completely agree with what you said, that one of the upshots of being a pure DPS spec and having some crossover between our legendaries does mean we have a lot of options. So I'm largely happy with our legendary pool. Some of them are stinkers, but that's kind of overwhelmed by the fact that we've got some solid ones, and I don't think there's any concerns that we'll find somewhere to land for any of the specs on a decent legendary. So I think legendaries are a successful mechanic to bring back. I'm far less convinced about where we're at with the Covenant abilities, just because, like we talked about before, 3 out of 4 are very questionably designed and implemented and interact with our specs in various weird ways. And I'm not sure how that's going to play out. I really don't like the idea of being funneled down, having to choose being a one-trick assassination the entire Shadowlands because X Conduit is best and then bad for Outlaw. I just don't think that's going to be good. Okay. But I think the core of the class is fine. I think, going back on what some of the areas we talked about before, I've still got some concerns about raid utility, survivability, specific to raids, not so much Mythic Plus, but, overall, I'd say that kind of element in raids and the covenants are my biggest concerns.
Okay. The core of the class is really quite functional. I'm not getting at least the impression from you guys, like overall class, each spec, that there's something that's just miserable. And we kind of started the show with this, and it seemed subtlety was certainly lacking, but it was more of like a numbers thing. And a lot of the changes seem to have at least gone in a positive direction. So come the end of Shadowlands, you guys aren't going to feel like miserable, Swiss cheese gutted specs with holes all over the place. Rather, it seems you're getting a nice addendum to your powers. Undad, what do you think?
Yeah, I think mostly the specs all feel complete. I think that's why like obviously we're talking about bugs with things a lot in this discussion, just to point out that they do exist. And even the fact that Rogue has been behind, like lagging behind other classes as far as the changes we've gotten. But I think most of us that just play Rogue and have played Rogue for, I guess I say a while. I've only really played it for one expansion, but it feels like a while. I guess that's what BFA did to us. But it feels like we're gonna be fine. Like I've never been worried about man, we're not getting attention, or man, this needs to be changed. It's mostly little things that I think will be weird scaling issues that could help out specs in specific places, like Assassination's energy right now and Secret Technique needing shadow damage. Those are the two, if I were to say two things I need to be touched on, those would be it. And if they're not touched on, the class is going to play okay. So I generally do feel positive, given all the talk we've had about bugs and negatives of covenants. I think those are all just expansion downfalls rather than class downfalls.
Okay. So generally positive thoughts. Mystler, what do you think? Where do Rogue stand right now? Koji mentioned, obviously, for the most part, it seems that we're all on board. I'm on that Rogue train too. We're all on board, at least from a raid leading perspective. We're all on board of the... It seems really just like raid utility, but perhaps part of the bigger meta issue is utility across the board. Maybe needs to be revisited. But how are you looking at Rogue's stance overall moving into Shadowlands?
I think my opinion doesn't really differ too much from what the others already said. I think we are carried into Shadowlands by having a pretty solid base for every spec that is fun to play and that works. And I think that is the reason why Rogue saw comparatively few changes over the course of the alpha and beta so far. I'm not worried at all about that the core of the specs will be fine, and if you enjoy any of the Rogue specs in BFA, I'm pretty sure you will also enjoy it in Shadowlands. So I don't have any worries there. Really, all of the concerning parts is what we've kind of touched today throughout the show, with obviously bugs. We are tracking all of the bugs that we know about, or trying to track all of them in a bug tracker. Hit us up on Ravenhold if you're a Rogue and you want to look at all the bugs, or you want to report new bugs that you think we aren't aware of yet. In our bug tracker, we have over 60 or almost 60 known bugs currently, out of which I think 4 bugs so far have been fixed throughout the entire expansion, which is what the alpha and beta, which concerns me a little bit. They definitely have to step up their rate of fixing bugs, not just 1 bug per month, basically. And but yeah, assuming that all of these things are addressed and that we can get some more clarity on how things are supposed to be, I think we can also make this go into a direction that is fine for everyone. Otherwise, we've mentioned the concerns with utility maybe being a little bit inconsistent, and with covenants feeling very inconsistent with how you would want to pick them and what they might lock you in. The weekly Conduit lockout, for example, for Assassination, where you have to decide on, do I want to AoE or a single target? It's little things like these that might end up annoying if they are not addressed and make me a little bit concerned. But ultimately, I think we'll end up in a position where we can still enjoy our class.
But everybody wants to enjoy it to its maximum potential, of course, and kind of being locked in, not so
Exactly.
fun. I never want to turn these episodes into like a huge kind of anger session about the Covenant thing. I think I haven't had a single show yet where anybody said like, oh no, this is great. It's always concerns for, just being locked in, lack of choice. So I think we're kind of all on the same boat on that. So let's take some questions now, because the show has definitely gone on a while. I didn't want to cut you guys or interrupt you, because you guys are just so damn passionate about talking about Rogue. So it's been a lot of fun to watch. But we do need to end it at some point. And we've kind of gotten to the list of things. I know as you guys are looking through the doc, the end of it, we've already talked about it. If you if you forgot, we've talked about several points in the show. Part of the meta issue, Blizzard, why does it take so long to get to some of these, community perception against subtlety, particularly, etc., skill capping of them. So these are all stuff we've talked about. I promised you guys it would be out of order, and it was. So I kept my promise there. But nonetheless, we'll take some questions from chat. Guys, keep in mind, anything that I don't get or we don't get to is because it's probably been answered somewhere in the show already. The VOD will be up, the YouTube will be up eventually, so you can pick it apart at your leisure. But nonetheless, let's get the ball rolling here. So does the Akari, I guess this one's more towards Mystler for now, does the Akari sub Lego interact with Slaughter in any way?
It does not.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty much the answer.
All right, we don't need to go into crazy detail. What do you guys think about Shadow Vault kind of crowd controlling you every second GCD?
I hate it. I don't know. I don't think is there a single monk that is like, man, I love when I hit Whirling Dragon Punch and I just fly in the air and I can't move. Is that like, I don't know if that person exists, but they don't exist in the rogue community. We don't want it. I don't I don't want to be stuck in a spot for a second.
Especially as a rogue, so mobile. Koji, will assassin be viable once we hit 34% crit cap again?
33.8% is the correct value.
I'm sorry.
And that is because that's the value I have on my gear.
Ah, okay. So that's the case then with that cap?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a bit of a meme. Don't fall for it.
I'm just the messenger. Please don't shoot me. What are you guys' personal thoughts on some of the buffs that they could give to roll the bones so that there's not such a wide spread on the variance in player power that you get from RNG? Undad?
I guess you could go two routes. You could either buff the bad ones. I don't think nerfing the good ones. I don't know what exactly you had. I guess increase the energy regeneration. I would personally like it so when you roll the bones, the idea was brought up earlier that you get like your next finisher has some sort of impact. Like they could bake like some legendary ideas, like your next Between the Eyes, if you roll this buff, empowers your pistol shot, or your next pistol shot generates bonus combo points, or something along those lines rather than just a maintenance buff. But I think that's something that in a perfect world, we'd have communication with the devs, and that would be like an open conversation, because I don't think that's easily solved. I don't think it's quickly solved, and I think that's going to be an ongoing issue for Outlaw until it's addressed, other than just like raise the numbers of buried treasure or something like that. But I think that's a pretty boring way to fix it.
What do you think, Koji?
I think they could play around with a couple more mechanics. I think there's a few untapped design spaces with, say making your next blade flurry do more damage, or doing something with pistol shot with your next finisher. I don't know. Like I think there are some more interesting things they could come up with than +4 energy per second. But I would take it if they increased that 4 to like a 20. That would at least be better.
All right. Mystler, what do you think? Any creative thoughts there?
Yeah, I think Roll the Bones is the kind of thing that you can address from a very careful approach to a very risky approach. You can start by just looking at the buffs and trying to tune them in a way that they are somewhat more balanced, but you can take this all the way to my earlier suggestion of reworking it into just giving you single one impact buffs. There's pretty much anything possible. I don't really have very good suggestions on what particular they should do. That's, I guess, something that the designers would have to spend some time tinkering with.
All right. What are the stat prios looking like briefly for each spec, Koji, from the world of TC?
I don't know if we have a firm idea of that until we start seeing the builds and legendaries come together, because those are really going to impact it pretty heavily. They've done a few things to try to bring up the value of some of the straggler stats, which I think is okay, but I think we'll need more time to really see how that comes out. I think one of the concerns, with any spec going into BFA or going into Shadowlands, with the changes from BFA to the secondary stat scaling that kind of were data mined out over the last week or so, where they diminish once they reach a certain point, they start getting diminishing returns. I think that definitely is good for specs that have broad secondary stat profiles, and Assassination is a good example of Assassination. Pretty much all four stats are relatively equal on BFA, and that's really not likely to change for Shadowlands. And it's great for them because spreading the stats around and kind of maximizing your secondary budget will be totally fine. But if we ended up like a situation where Outlaw right now on BFA has a very low mastery value, it just puts them at a disadvantage of taking advantage of their gear stat budget.
Okay. What do you guys think are the best, or perhaps some of the best? Obviously, things will change for PvP, etc. But some of the best races for the 3 rogue specs. Undad, what do you think?
Undead.
Okay. Undead. What about Alliance side? Undead.
Oh, I want to play Undead and Dwarf just because I like those races. There's no like meaning behind what I'm saying here.
No, okay.
There's no like, I don't think it matters enough. If you really care, Blood Elf feels good gameplay wise, just to generate energy. And on Alliance side, I think you still go Dwarf. You don't need to meld. You can skip stuff anyway.
All right.
I mean, we all know that the best transmog is at least a 10% DPS increase, so pick the race that you can make the best transmog for.
Very true. Well stated. Basically, chat, it's not that big of a deal is what they're saying.
Yeah, I don't care at all. Like I've sat all of BFA as an orc, which is like literally the worst assassination race, and I'm just not going to change because I like my character.
And money. Peony asks, Mystler mentioned earlier that maybe rogue utility should be consolidated into something more consistently useful rather than a lot of tools that are only sometimes meaningful. How do you feel about, as example, merging evasion and cloak into a full immunity?
That is a good example. It kind of, yes, it would make it more consistent, as in you do not have to worry about figuring out what does it work with, and for example, look up, is this a physical thing that I can dodge, or is this a magical thing? Which button do I have to press if I want to try to immune it? So having one button just says, okay, this is my immune for everything, I think would make it much more straightforward and more predictable again. But then again, it does not really eliminate the issue of it just not working with anything. As we said, Cloak of Shadows is on a lot of blacklists where it just doesn't work with anything. And I don't think merging these two solves the issue of Blizzard having these schools that they don't like and putting them on the blacklist. So if they end up doing that with the merge spell as well, then the win is very marginal.
Okay. Could keeping a 2-charge system for Shadow Dance while doubling down on the cooldown reduction component of ES keep the talent tier more competitive? Whoever wants to tackle that.
I think if you're suggesting removing the charge portion of Enveloping Shadows and giving us 2 charges base, I think that's definitely a step in the right direction. It'll come down to numbers to see how that works out, but it certainly will feel better to play Dark Shadow. Playing Dark Shadow with 1 charge in the current CDR feels awful to me. Maybe you guys have different opinions, but especially in dungeons, it just feels like when you're finishing with 6 combo points so often in dungeons, you get your dance back, and then you have to spend it, and then it desyncs again before Symbols comes back for the second time, and you're just like in this like weird waiting game where like you just want them to line up, and 2 charges lets that happen. So
okay.
Yeah. what worries me a little bit about this is if it might flip the entire thing just in the other direction and doesn't solve too much. With the longer 8-second dance, this will dramatically increase uptime on Shadow Dance, and basically eliminate all this idea of few dances that are strong, because you have to tune around these more dances then. And all of the benefit that enveloping shadows would have is faster cooldown reduction, which may also end up being worth much less in AoE. So this may flip the entire thing just towards dark shadows instead of enveloping shadows, and possibly not end up solving much either. So not sure about that one.
We kind of touched on this a bit earlier. I suppose, Undad, if you want to at least spearhead this one, everyone's, of course, welcome to comment. Do you expect Outlaw Rogue will be the only spec viable for high Mythic Plus, since Vanish as defensive becomes extremely powerful, but it will be a huge chunk of DPS loss for the other specs?
No. As long as Outlaw cannot apply Numbing Poison in AoE, I don't expect Outlaw to be, like, in the highest keys, I don't expect Outlaw to be better. I think in middling tier keys, like, what effectively would be, like, I guess, like 15 to 20s, maybe low 20s right now, if you think of BFA difficulty, Outlaw will probably be the superior spec, but assuming Numbing Poison doesn't get spread by Blade Flurry, and it does by Shuriken Storm and Fan of Knives, and Numbing Poison works on mobs in dungeons, making your tank take 15% less damage from melees is invaluable. And I don't think, like, in the highest keys where that begins to matter, I think you'll see other specs get playtime because of that reason.
Okay. What do you guys think, Koji?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just depends so much on the poison aspect. But I think, as we touched on before, the damage is going to be largely normalized by the caps, and I think all three specs are going to be pretty viable. I'm not sure. I think Vanish right now for Outlaw is a very, very strong situational Mythic Plus thing. But that's largely because Outlaw gains nothing from vanishing. And I think there are now a lot of situations due to the Master Assassin Legendary coming back where that is not going to be the case. So I think that premise somewhat is using like BFA principles instead of Shadowland principles. And if Master Assassin is the go-to for dungeons like it was for most of Legion, then Vanish becomes a very strong DPS cooldown for all three specs.
Okay. What do you, we got basically two more questions here. Guys, a lot of the ones you're asking, by the way, have been answered before, but we also got to get going. So, so two more questions here. How impactful is Shroud in M+ currently, would you say? We kind of touched on this earlier, but do you think basically it's overshadowed and not nearly as powerful because of Awakened right now, and we're going to kind of be back to square one in M+ Shadowlands?
I think it's difficult to say this early. I think there's actually a lot of situations I've found in Shadowlands dungeons where the way the count lines up, if you just kind of go in a straight line, you don't need Shroud as much as you did in BFA dungeons. They've kind of tuned count to, you don't end up at 150% if you just walk through the dungeon, which obviously removes some of the value of Shroud. But until we're able to build like actual efficient routes out and we get like a meta for how each dungeon is pulled, it's difficult to say. Interesting that if Priest becomes meta, there's a lot of things you can do with Mind Soothe that remove the need for Shroud, and you just walk by mobs because you reduce their aggro radius by a lot. Like, it's significant. It feels really weird walking by non-CC'd mobs and you're under 10 yards away from them and they don't aggro. So I think a lot of it has to do with what the actual meta ends up being, how often we see other classes, how good Priest in both Shadow and Disc form, probably not Holy, are, but I think it's too early to tell. It's probably too strong. It probably needs to be looked at. But we also have Engineering Stealth, which I don't think anybody's leveled Engineering on beta yet to see how effective it is. The Engineering Belt enchant that gives you Stealth on a 2-minute cooldown could play a big factor into how useful Shroud is. So,
what do you think, Mist?
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to that. Undad is obviously our Mythic Plus expert there. So I defer to that.
All right. Final question, which usually comes from me. If we didn't have any player power, in a happy world, of course, if we didn't have any player power tied at all to Covenants, which one did you guys choose from a thematic and lore perspective? Koji?
That's a tough one. That's a tricky one. What my character would choose? I don't know. Probably Venthyr.
Yep. Have you seen what those weapon enchants look like when you have Slaughter Poison on? Like, I would be going Venthyr 100%. Not a
Yeah.
question about it.
Looks pretty sweet. The
Just-
bloody weapons.
Just going by flavor and setting and style, I really like Kyrian, so that would be my choice. And Owls for the win.
So how bad does it feel that you can't do those? Because you have to go Necrolord.
Man, come on.
You've been baited.
Don't do this.
All right, gents. We could sit here and talk all day, but we do have to move along. So as we end with every show, parting thought or thoughts could be anything. Could be an address to the devs. Could be what you want to see with the spec. Could be optimize the things that you're happy or excited about for Shadowlands, things that you're worried about, whatever it may be. Undad, if you have any parting thoughts for our army of rogues watching.
I'm pretty excited. I hope they remove the animation lock on Shadow Vault. And can I link our page for
Absolutely.
where we're collecting bugs, where we have our bug tracker?
You
that
can either...
anybody else that's on beta.
I got you 1 second. You filthy
Oh,
nuts.
okay, sorry, I linked too fast.
Go ahead. You're good.
All right. So this is where we're tracking. I don't know if that's sent because it was identical to previous.
I'll relink it for you anyway. Don't worry.
All right, perfect. So that's just where we're tracking bugs. So anybody that does have beta access and is playing Rogue, if you'd like to contribute, please help us out there.
Yep, everyone with a GitHub account should have access to add something there. You may not be able to label it as Rogue, but just shoot Koji or me a note. We can do that for you. We all appreciate anybody adding a bug that we haven't collected there yet. So
Okay.
and it's also a great overview if you want to check out what the current known bugs are or if anything has been fixed. You can also comment on there. That's great.
All right. Koji, parting thoughts?
Oh, thanks for having us. It's been great to chat with these guys and talk about Rogue stuff. It's been cool. Overall, I'm excited. I'm cautiously optimistic, I guess, that these bugs will all get rounded up and fixed, and that we can go forward with our day and work on the more fun aspects of theory crafting and playing our spec. I think my main hope, plea is to make strides towards all three specs being viable to some close enough degree that people can play what they want to play, because I think all three specs are really cool and really fun, and I think it's unfortunate that so many people don't feel like they have the opportunity to take advantage of that.
Right. Fair thought. Mystler, what do you think?
Yeah, same. After Nyalotha rating S sub, my vision how I go into SL is just please don't make sub bad, and it currently seems to be the case. So I'm also cautiously optimistic there, and I hope that a lot of the bugs will get fixed, and we won't end up spending too much of our time trying to figure out how to best play around bugs. So the outlook so far is good, and Shadowlands as an expansion in general with the new zones and settings looks very impressive. I'm eager to play that as some new content in the new expansion. So yeah, and other than that, shout out to everyone in the work community, to all the friends that help us, to people that support, people that report things. You're awesome. Thanks a lot.
Alrighty. I chat, you guys keep asking, don't worry, there's already been Havoc DH hate. We all know that we hate Havoc DHs here, and the Rogue community as well, I'm sure. I will ambassador and speak for them, even if they disagree on this. But guys, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sticking around. It's definitely been a juicy long episode again, but you guys are just, beyond any show we've had so far, the amount of detail and attention to detail, and you even have a GitHub for all your bugs and stuff, has been truly not only impressive, but a lot of fun to watch. I just had genuinely good time powwowing with you guys about rogues.
As a side note, that is actually this tracker by the Simcraft team, so that is open to all specs. So if you do not play Rogue and you want to report some bugs, feel free to use that as well. It's appreciated, so that's for everyone.
Perfect, yeah. Okay, so it benefits everyone, even better. So guys, it's been an absolute pleasure. hopefully all your bugs get worked out, and all the kinks get worked out, and rogues are looking to be in a good spot. And power to sub. You've turned me into a believer. I will try playing it again because I played it at the beginning of Alpha and really didn't like it. But it looks like it's come a bit of a way since then, so I'll give it a shot, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon, guys, and talk more about rogues once they hit live.
Thanks
Thanks for having us.
All right, guys. Take it easy, stay safe, and chat with you guys soon.